Okay, May 40 here. So this Joe Biden cognitive decline story has left the realm of the temporal. It's left the realm of ordinary news stories. It's entered the realm of the moral and the sacred. And you hear the main players discussed not primarily in terms of their self-interest, which is how normally political news is analyzed and covered. All right, the Republicans have this interest, the Democrats have that interest. Now, anyone who's willing to come forward with damaging information about Joe Biden and his cognitive decline and how it's been covered up, right, that person is regarded as a patriot. Right? If people had done that prior to the disastrous debate June 27th, right, their motives would have been questioned. And why on earth is this Democrat leaking this information at this point against Joe Biden? And so the focus would be on motives. But now we aren't hearing a lot of analysis of the motives of the primary players, right? We've entered the realm of the sacred. So that's an example of how this story has taken on connotations of Watergate, right? Because Watergate was not primarily about the political players and their self-interested motivations, all right? Facts don't speak for themselves. They always need a context. They need a narrative, and the context for this Joe Biden decline story is changed from that of the temporal to that of the eternal, all right? This story is no longer a partisan one. It's an American one. The health of the republic is at risk, all right? We have a national security risk, and the problem is an infection of lies emanating from the White House, just as in Watergate, where the problem was the lies emanating from the White House. So all sides of the American political spectrum are increasingly demanding that Joe Biden step down because he has broken his contract with America. He's exhibited bad faith. So bad faith refers to honesty or fraud, and it means dishonest belief or purpose, untrustworthy performance of duties, neglect of fair dealing standards, fraudulent intent. So now we're hearing about a Parkinson's specialist spending a great deal of time and making numerous visits to the White House. What the heck is going on? Was Joe Biden's cognitive decline diagnosed or undiagnosed? Either way, it's a heck of a story. So Professor Jeffrey Alexander is a sociologist, I believe, at Yale, and he wrote in his 2003 book an essay, The Meaning of Social Life, A Cultural Sociology. So he talked about how Watergate just started out as a third-rate burglary, neither politically motivated nor seen as morally relevant. Then the Democrats took it up, said it was a major act of political espionage, a symbol of a demagogic and amoral Republican president. But Americans were not persuaded by this extreme reaction, and the incident received relatively little attention in 1972. It did not generate any widespread sense of outrage. Now, with Joe Biden, the majority of Democrats did not want him to run for a second term. So his run for a second term was an installation by the elites. So now the elite outrage of Joe Biden is following up on the disgust of the majority of Democrats for the past few years. So in 1972, the news media played down the Watergate story, all right, not because they were coerced, but because they genuinely felt it was a relatively unimportant event. So how did the perception of Watergate change? Right, so Watergate itself was relatively inconsequential, and it wasn't a new collection of facts that changed the perception of Watergate. But what happened is that we moved from the mundane level of goals, power, and interests to the realm of values. And that's also what we're seeing with this Joe Biden story. So values of truth, honesty, the republic. So profane politics means self-interested politics. But sacred politics, right, is the realm of beautiful and the good and the true and the holy versus that which is dangerous and dark and bad for the republic. So we've now entered the realm of righteousness, and there needs to be some sort of ritual by which the public can feel cleansed of the disgusting, infectious nature of the lies that are threatening to pollute our republic coming from the Biden White House. All right, there needs to be some sort of ritual and purification process so we can move from the structural, the profane, and the impure back to some kind of symbolic, sacred, pure center of society. So we might get televised hearings asking, when did Biden's aides know that he was infirm, frail, senile? When did they know it, right? And how did they help cover it up? And so the story is kind of moving, in a sense, out of time to a new realm. And so we have editing, repetition, juxtaposition, simplification, other techniques that allow this story to increasingly appear mythical. And so if we have televised hearings, we'll get the hushed voices of the announcers, the pomp and ceremony of the event. And so we will get a construction of a sacred time and a sacred space. And through TV, tens of millions of Americans might get to participate symbolically and emotionally in the deliberations of a Senate or House committee. And viewing might become seen as morally obligatory. Old routines might be broken, new ones formed. And we might get, ringing and unabashed affirmations of the universalist myths that are the backbone of American civic culture, that Americans should behave virtuously, nobody should be selfish or inhumane, no American should be so concerned with money or power that it blinds his commitment to fair play, no team loyalty should be so strong that it violates the common good or makes criticism toward authority unnecessary. We should return to truth and justice as the basis of American political society. So let's get a quick burst here from Howard Kurtz from Fox.
It was just 1 month ago that the Wall Street Journal was criticized and even denounced for a story headline, "Behind Closed Doors, Biden shows signs of slipping." Quote, he read from notes to make obvious points, paused for extended periods, and sometimes closed his eyes for so long that some in the room wondered whether he had tuned out. And yet the piece was widely attacked.
I am sort of actually embarrassed for the Wall Street Journal with this piece. This piece is so tilted, so off the mark. Is he 81 years old? Yes.
In the wake of President Biden's disastrous debate and a growing media and Democratic revolt against his candidacy, co-author Annie Linsky says she was surprised at the chorus of condemnation.
What we've seen in the last few days is the reporting that we did was vindicated. We had a very high bar for what we were willing to report and what my editors were willing to report.
Where does the Journal go to get its apology? And this cover of The Economist says it all. Now, other journalists are digging into Biden's mental fitness. The New York Times reporting that to White House officials, he increasingly appeared confused or listless or would lose the thread of conversations.
There have been 15, 20 occasions in the last year and a half when the president has appeared somewhat as he did.
So if you go to church or you go to synagogue or you go to mosque and the religious leader of your community stands up and speaks, all right, you don't get the sense that he's speaking out of his self-interest, right? And obviously he's just as self-interested as a plumber or someone in construction. But the setting, the rituals, the precedents, the tradition, the scene all set the stage for someone who is speaking for God, for speaking for tradition, speaking for the best interests of the community as a whole. And so the scene, the setting, the narrative, the precedents, all right, they create how we respond to a message. So if your pastor, your rabbi, your imam stood up and spoke and you overwhelmingly saw his speech in terms of his own self-interest, that it's not so much he wants us to become holier and more ethical, he just wants to increase his power over our lives, then you would be very much breaking with the norm. All right, if you shared that perspective with your community, it would be highly unpopular. The only exception would be is if the community had come to see your religious leader as unfit for office. And then if people start talking about your leader's unfitness for office, that he's operating in his own self-interest, he just wants to aggrandize himself, he just wants to hold on to power, then your religious leader's time in authority in your community is very short. And that's how Joe Biden is being seen now, as just hanging on in delusion, right? Just grasping on to power.
In that horror show that we witnessed.
With Biden betting on an interview with George Stephanopoulos, some media liberals are saying he should just resign and hand the presidency to Kamala Harris. 5 Democratic members of Congress so far have publicly called for the president to step aside. And the Times, in a report that a White House spokesman called absolutely false, says Biden told a key ally that he knows he may not be able to stay in the race unless he can change public opinion in the coming days. The overriding media question now, can he weather this storm? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz.
Okay, so we're moving into something that's unprecedented. We've never had a story just like this. Gosh, I'm invoking cliches, but it's hard to think of something that's similar to this. And the number one difference between liberal and conservative news media over the past 5 years has been that the conservative news media has consistently regarded Joe Biden as senile and obviously unfit for office, obviously cognitively not there. And the liberal news media, overwhelmingly, with a few exceptions, has derided this conservative fixation and said it is based on cheap fakes, it's based on partisanship, it's not based in reality. And on the biggest divide in the news in the United States over the past 5 years, the conservative news media has proved to be correct, right? You would get more wisdom on this story, right, from your 115 IQ right-wing talk show host. You got more wisdom on this story from Sean Hannity at Fox News than you did, by and large, from the high IQ liberal elite media. So why were 100 IQ conservative plumbers able to spot Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline and 140 IQ political and media elites not able to see it? And I think it primarily comes down to liberal speech codes. So there's a refrain among liberal members of the news media that covering the president's age was a very sensitive issue. They were reluctant to do it because they did not want to be accused of ageism and ableism. Now, that's almost unfathomable to me, because to me there are no such moral categories as ableism and ageism, particularly with regard to President of the United States. There's any evidence that he is not fit for office, that he is not cognitively there, then that's an obvious news story. Now, I don't normally think in terms of fit for office, because it just strikes me as overwhelmingly a propaganda term, because I don't have an elevated perception of political office, right? To me, it's just one more human expression of the desire to thrust for power. Some people turn to preaching, some people turn to live streaming, other people turn to taking care of their kids, right? There's a human impulse to elevate ourselves in social status, and I just take that for granted. And so I don't expect any moral or cognitive test for political office, and I wouldn't take it seriously when liberals talked about Donald Trump being unfit for office, because it struck me then, and it strikes me now, as fit for office is usually liberal propaganda speak, code speak for we need less politicization and more professionalization and more expertise. So determining whether or not someone's fit for office is usually a liberal concern, and the standard is, does the person meet up to the hero standards of liberalism? Will they pass tests by professionals, by the elite? So what common sense is to conservatives, right? Belief in expertise and science and expert consensus is to liberals. And so this idea of fit for office is overwhelmingly a liberal concern. But now it's such a dominant part of our narrative, it's kind of hard to think about the Joe Biden story without that accompanying fit for office. Now, I'm not at all outraged by Joy Reid saying that she would vote for Joe Biden in a coma over any Republican candidate, because I think if most people are honest in their political preferences, right, if you identify as a Republican, you will vote for a Republican even if they're in a coma over a Democrat. And if you identify as a Democrat, you will, of course, you'll vote for a Democrat in a coma over a Republican. So I see politics as an expression of the evolutionary struggle for survival. I don't think in terms of fit for office. But now this story has elevated itself from humdrum concerns of clashing conflicts of interest to the realm of the sacred and the holy. It's a whole new world.
Are mostly downbeat, with James Carville citing a CBS post-debate poll.
We have a country that 72% want something different. If the Democratic Party can't produce something different that 72% of people want, then why do we exist?
Yeah.
What are we here for?
That's key, because initially I thought, oh, this is an elite-driven story, because there hasn't been a change in grassroots attitudes initially. But the grassroots of the Democratic Party have made it clear for years that they do not want Joe Biden to run for a second term. So initially I thought, oh, this is an elite-driven story. Then I recognized, oh, the elite's just catching up to the public sentiment. And now the elite's catching up to the public sentiment that has filtered back to the grassroots, so that when congressmen, all right, talk to their constituents, all people want to talk about is Joe Biden's fitness for office.
I mean, the country is clamoring for change.
I do not think he's going to be their nominee. I don't know that he makes it to the end of his term.
He needs to do everything he can to reverse the impression, the clear impression that was left by that debate.
If there is concern that the president doesn't have the acuity to handle an hour or an hour and a half of questions, I don't understand the delay. Why not just have a press conference right now?
In that exclusive interview with ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos, Biden was on the defensive, saying he wouldn't drop out unless the Lord Almighty told him to.
Do you dispute that there have been more lapses, especially in the last several months?
Can I run the 110 flat? No, but I'm still in good shape.
Are you more frail?
No.
Do you have the mental and physical capacity to do it for another 4 years?
I believe so. I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I did. Look.
Mr. President, I've never seen a president at 36% approval get reelected.
Well, I don't believe that's my approval rate. That's not what our polls show.
Sure. So the interviewer there, George Stephanopoulos, should have followed up with, okay, which polls show what? All right, what's the basis for your assertion? So when Joe Biden talked about he needs to be reelected so he can continue on with his Middle East peace plan, what basis, Mr. President, is your Middle East peace plan effective? The Middle East seems like an absolute mess. All right, we seem on the verge of a major conflagration right now. Why on earth? What's your basis for believing that your Middle East peace plan is particularly effective? So one sign of a story moving from the humdrum to the sacred is the story becomes increasingly covered in moral terms. And so we see liberal columnist Jonathan Chait writing for New York Magazine today, the problems are ethical, not just political, with the Biden team. Joe Biden has not broken any laws, but he has violated two important norms. First, he brought his crack addict son Hunter in to serve as an advisor in the White House, right? So Biden's aides are raising concerns like, what on earth is Hunter Biden doing in our key meetings? Right? What the hell is happening? Like, why did Joe Biden turn to his crack addict son as the primary person to prepare him for the George Stephanopoulos interview? And then the second and more severe violation of norms that Joe Biden is engaged in is he's ignoring the need to examine his cognitive health. Right? He has continually dismissed the need for a cognitive exam. So many different angles to this story, but perhaps one that is particularly juicy to discuss as a conservative. All right, I'm on the right. I strive at times to rise above my partisanship, but one particular juicy story is the media conspiracy to hide Joe Biden's cognitive condition as long as the news media thought he was the Democrats' best option for taking down Donald Trump. And then after the debate, when it became clear that Joe Biden was not the Democrats' best option for taking down Donald Trump, that he was going to lose to Donald Trump, that the absolute fury that the news media has exhibited, their relentlessness in going after Joe Biden, now that it's clear that he cannot defeat Donald Trump. So they've completely switched. Now, if I stood up here and cited a bunch of conservative commentators saying that there's been a media conspiracy to hide Joe Biden's cognitive decline, that wouldn't have any wider resonance outside of the right wing. What you need are people who are nonpartisan saying the same thing. And you increasingly do hear this from members of the conventional mainstream news media. Right? Mark Halperin, the best political reporter and commentator we have today, said explicitly yesterday that the news media has engaged in a conspiracy to hide Joe Biden's cognitive decline from the American public. Axios published yesterday that the news media has been deliberately hiding Joe Biden's cognitive decline from the American people, right? So the conventional mainstream media is increasingly accepting that, yeah, our profession has hidden Joe Biden's cognitive decline from the American public for partisan reasons. So between 2016 and 2019, the number one news story in the United States was that Donald Trump's team had cooperated with Russia and Vladimir Putin to manipulate the American elections. And then the Mueller report came out and showed that there was insufficient evidence for that allegation. So that was the number one story for 3 years, all right? There was a consistent difference in the way that the conservative news media covered that story and the liberal news media covered that story. And the conservatives were right. Then we had the death of George Floyd and the summer of George and Black Lives Matter and a rapid increase in crime. We had the Ferguson effect back in 2014 due to Black Lives Matter. And again, the conservative media was much more accurate that the Ferguson effect, the George Floyd effect, led to an explosion in unnecessary deaths due to a dramatic increase in violent crime in this country, with also repercussions for reckless driving and driving deaths and pedestrian deaths, and now also a remarkable increase in deaths by suicide in the Black community in particular. So the conservative news media was far superior to the liberal news media in covering that story. On the other hand, conservatism has developed an increasing distrust of expertise as more and more experts are in the realm of liberal politics. So conservatives used to have the same respect for science and expertise as liberals just 20 years ago. Now that's completely changed. Conservatives have this knee-jerk distrust of expertise, and they've been shown, I think, by COVID to frequently be wrong. So many conservative right-wing talk show hosts refused to get vaccinated and then died from COVID. So, you know, my opinion that liberals on the left generally had a more responsible attitude towards containing COVID because they were less constrained by the knee-jerk conservative opposition to deference to expertise and the knee-jerk conservative opposition to removing rights and the knee-jerk conservative opposition to big government. So controlling something like the coronavirus provides a basis for the temporary taking away of rights. And many conservative commentators said, oh, this is just part of a big government push by Democrats, and we're going to lose these rights forever. And that just did not turn out to be true, right? The rights to freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of participating in your religion at a church or a synagogue, they were returned shortly after widespread vaccination. So conservatives were wrong on many things with regard to COVID. So it's not like I think that conservatives don't have their blind spots. Like every individual has their blind spots, right? Everything that we hold sacred then becomes a blind spot for us. Conservatives have their blind spots. Jews have their blind spots. Christians have their blind spots. Young people have their blind spots. For example, up until the late 20s, right, most people have a vastly exaggerated sense of their own capability. So young people have their blind spots. Old people have their blind spots. We all have their blind spots. But what we don't get in conventional discourse is pointing out typical blind spots by Jewish intellectuals, typical blind spots by conservative Christian intellectuals, typical blind spots of the young or the old, or of blacks or gays or evangelical Christians. All right, all groups have their blind spots. Let's just play a little bit more here from Howard Kurtz.
Problem, polls are wrong. It was just one bad night.
Well, that interview, you really didn't see him acting much different than you've seen him act for many months now, many years now. So you can describe it now as halting and low energy, but this is what Americans have been seeing for a long time. And a lot of even Democrat voters have felt this way about Biden, and yet they nominated him to be their candidate. And so this Stephanopoulos interview looks more like a Democrat operative, and he is one, trying to implore a fellow political ally to get out of the race for the good of the Democrat Party.
Well, Stephanopoulos hasn't been, at least officially, since the days of the Clinton White House, a Democratic operative. But Richard, David Axelrod, who of course worked for Obama, called the interview showing.
Know about that? I mean, the vast majority.
So Molly Hemingway wrote a book on the 2020 election, and to the extent that Republicans and conservatives can make a case that the election was rigged, she has done the best job. Now, I wasn't convinced. I thought there were many shortcomings to her book, but she still did the best job of any conservative about changes in voting laws in the 2020 election that may have not created a level playing field.
The majority of Americans have, with their own eyes and ears, witnessed the decline of this president. It was a major talking point in 2020. We're talking about a White House press corps that had no problem running wild with accusations and anonymous sources and conspiracy theories when it was a Republican, Donald Trump. But now we're supposed to believe that they were somehow duped, that the rest of the country could see something that they couldn't see. I don't buy it. I don't think any Americans buy it. The level of media corruption that we're seeing is complete at this point. They didn't cover the story because they thought it would be bad for Democrats to talk about the senility of the president. And now they're covering it because they've lost confidence in their ability to drag Joe Biden across the finish line. There's nothing honest about this, and they don't get any points whether they...
All right, so they thought that Joe Biden was their best bet to defeat Donald Trump in the fall. And after the debate, they saw that he was not going to defeat Donald Trump.
Start covering it now or not?
As we look at live pictures of the president at a black church in North Philadelphia, Mount Airy, I guess I would just say that.
So amazing. It's just so bad.
So interesting commentary from the former president, with Kamala Harris trailing Trump in one poll by only 2 points, better than Biden. There's sort of a new buzz about her, especially with Jim Clyburn saying if Biden doesn't run, he will back the vice president. What do you make of all that?
I think it's worth noting that all of this desire to oust Biden is happening only among the media and other top Democrats. You are not seeing a groundswell calling for change from Democrat voters. Again, they just had a primary election.
You just are seeing this, right? The primary election was rigged, right? In 2016, the primary election was rigged to make Hillary Clinton the Democratic nominee. So she got answers to questions from CNN, unlike all the other candidates. So the primary elections for candidate for president in the Democratic Party have been largely rigged.
They just overwhelmingly chose this man to be their nominee.
And now there is growing grassroots opposition to Joe Biden running as the Democratic nominee.
And now the media are acting like there's, like, basically that doesn't matter. They don't feel confident in Biden. They want to replace him. And you have a media who are claiming that they were lied to because they think it would be better. They're willing to look stupid.
So one of the major themes of this show is the importance of situation. And this is a great test whether this theory that I have that I took from John M. Doris about how the situation is usually is often more important than any other factor for determining what's going on, right? This is a great test whether you can take this theory and apply it to worlds where you don't know nearly as much as the experts. So the dominant perspective of political experts all last week was that Joe Biden cannot be replaced as nominee for the Democratic Party. I don't know as much as the political experts, but armed with this theory of the importance of situation, and it's the situation that determines the relative importance of competing values, right? I saw the situation was so dire that Joe Biden will be forced to drop out. So perhaps this theory is more valuable than expertise in many different areas. Also, due to the dire nature of Kamala Harris being unpopular and not demonstrating the ability to think on her feet, to be verbally fluent, to respond well under pressure, I also suspect, opposed to almost all the political experts, that there will be akin to an open primary for the Democratic nomination. So will this construct of the situation win out over expertise? Because from the perspective of expertise, the idea of an open nomination now to be the Democratic nominee for president seems absolutely outlandish. So on the basis of precedent, on the basis of law, on the basis of expertise, right, the idea that we're going to have an open primary for the Democratic nominee for president is unfathomable and outlandish. From the construct of the situation determines what's the most important factor, right? That open primary seems like the most likely choice. So, yeah, I think there's going to be an open primary for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. And obviously, I know less than political elites, but sometimes if you've got a powerful enough construct, right, you can see reality more clearly than the experts. On the other hand, a construct, a conception of reality can blind you. So the United States conception of reality prior to Pearl Harbor was that the Japanese would not attack. And because this conception was inadequate, right, the United States was devastated in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Similarly, the Israelis had a conception that their enemies would not attack on Yom Kippur, 1973. Their conception proved to be inadequate, and Israel's enemies made substantial gains in the first 2 days of that war. Similarly, with regard to October 7, 2023, Israel's defense and intelligence establishment had a construct that Hamas wanted peace and was not a major threat to southern Israel. The construct was wrong, right? All this information was coming in that Hamas was planning a major attack, and the people in charge of Israel's military defense and intelligence were blinded to that information by their incorrect concept of reality. And so Israel was inept and largely defenseless when Hamas, overran its virtual wall. So sometimes a conception can give you great clarity and put you ahead of the experts in detecting what's going on. And other time, no matter how much you know, no matter how much expertise you have, right, your concept can blind you to reality.
And you have to be stupid to have not seen this story coming for 5 years. Or they're saying that they were lied to and they're so bad at their jobs they can't figure out how to deal with liars. And both of those things mean that it's the media who should actually resign before Joe Biden or anyone else.
Right.
They have shown
does that
themselves.
Mean every single journalist,
I would say,
news organization?
Probably the White House press corps should resign en masse unless they can show that they aggressively targeted this story for the last 5 years. Then they should, yes, absolutely.
Gretchen Whitmer denied a report that she told the White House that Biden would not win Michigan. She said it was full of S. No way if Biden doesn't run or is pushed out, whatever, no way to bypass Kamala Harris without a fierce blowback?
Listen, I definitely think Kamala Harris will be the problem, but I do think Molly brings a problem with both parties are guilty, and we should be looking at
his policies. They don't like inflation. They don't like what he's doing with foreign policy. They don't like domestic policy. And you have not heard the media.
So the news media has not wanted to focus on the issues on policy because most of them cut against the Biden administration, right? There are a few areas where the Biden team is more popular than the Republican approach, such as with regard to taxing the rich and with support for abortion rights. But on most policy issues, the Republican platform is more popular.
Media talking about the actual reason why Americans don't like Joe Biden. Instead, they're just doing all this about his health.
Well, but hold on.
Donald Trump.
But the race was
his policies either.
I want to get to this. 2 black radio hosts have confirmed that the Biden campaign gave them questions in advance.
I mean, how much lacking in integrity are these radio hosts to simply repeat the questions that are given to them by the Biden White House?
And they each used 4 of them. And even then he stumbled at times. Does that suggest that his own people don't trust the president to do routine interviews?
So again, this is something that the White House has been doing for years. No. If you follow non-leftist media, you have known this story for years. Well, you have seen the questions supplied.
That's true. She's absolutely right. This was the most dramatic divide between conservative media and liberal news media, right? Overwhelmingly on the conservative side, its leading commentators have pointed out that Joe Biden is cognitively not up to the task of President of the United States.
It's an outrageous journalistic breach.
So when it was caught on tape, on video before, that he was being handled questions and he knew exactly who was going to ask which.
So Molly Hemingway is a conservative partisan, but her arguments here are being increasingly echoed by mainstream prestigious journalists, such as the men running Axios, including Alex Thompson, Mike Allen, Jim Vandehey.
Which question? CNN said this was a mark of him being well prepared. Now they claim that this is some huge.
Right. The New York Times, shortly before the debate, ran a column saying that Joe Biden was like, Beethoven, right? Just getting better with age.
scandal when they were covering it for a year, for years, just a few years ago. The only thing that has changed is that the media went from covering this up because they thought it hurt Democrats to now making a big deal about it because they're.
So Molly Hemingway strikes me as the most compelling near-daily conservative commentator on TV. Who's better than Molly Hemingway?
They're worried that Joe Biden can't win. Everything can be understood through the prism of, does this help or hurt the Democrat Party? That's the only consistency in our media.
Well, I'm not sure.
That is a damaging charge, and this story makes it look like she's right.
But no,
I mean, that no military had died under his watch.
Yes, that was a mistake. That was a misstatement. It was false.
Trump also claimed that he has the highest rating in the VA, and that's not even a thing.
Yeah.
All right.
And then he said black jobs. We can go about that. And that's not a thing, because I don't know what a black job is.
The person you don't like.
There are characteristics of black jobs and Ashkenazi jobs. For example, Ashkenazi Jews normally don't serve in the military in the United States. They normally don't do manual labor jobs, right? So a far higher percentage of African Americans work in manual labor or janitorial or low-paying jobs compared to Ashkenazi Jews or compared to Northeast Asian citizens of the United States. So there are jobs that are distinguished by the differing percentages engaged in that occupation. So security guards seems to be overwhelmingly, at least in California, right, a black or a Hispanic job, right? Janitorial tends to be increasingly Hispanic job in California. Lower level construction jobs seem to be increasingly Hispanic jobs. Domestic labor used to be primarily a black job in the United States of America. Now it's increasingly a job held by Hispanics.
Joining us now from Florida, Ben Shapiro, co-founder of The Daily Wire, host of The Ben Shapiro Show, and a #1 New York Times best-selling author. Ben, you write in The Spectator that the mainstream media, trust in the mainstream media, has been fractured beyond repair, and obviously that's been building for years. Why do you think we've reached the breaking point now?
I think that in all other cases where the media have deceived the American public on everything from their over coverage of Russiagate to their coverage of COVID to Black Lives Matter, there's at least been this level of plausible deniability where they could still make the case that there were studies supporting what they were saying or that there were experts who suggested the opposite. What happened during the debate with Joe Biden and Donald Trump is that a case they'd been making about Joe Biden for years, which is that he was mentally and physically sound, or at least sound enough to be president of the United States, was exploded just in public, and everybody saw it, and there's no way to deny it. And it was also perfectly obvious that the press had to have known that because obviously people who are in the general public were noting Joe Biden's pretty obvious decline over the course of the past couple of years. And so when the media came out with this extraordinary outrage, this shock and surprise at Joe Biden's status, I think the American...
So this story is just one of many that emphasizes a dramatic gap between what your eyes see and what the arbiters of truth tell you is true. So the arbiters of truth occupy the high ground in our culture. They're the people who dominantly run most of our institutions. They dominantly have a liberal left worldview. So your eyes see that different groups commit different amounts of crime, right? There are different proportions of those who commit violent crime. It doesn't just break down, for example, to the demographics of the population. And so your eyes tell you that different groups have different gifts, but this is something that is socially unacceptable to say. Your eyes tell you that men and women have different gifts. Your eyes tell you that the game is sometimes, rigged against men, such as sexual harassment laws. So women can wear highly provocative clothing to the office, but if the man comments on it, the man's the one who gets into trouble. So differences between men and women, differences between racial, ethnic, religious groups, right? Proclivities towards violent crime or to cheating on taxes, right? Tend to differ between groups. And there are all these obvious discrepancies between what your own eyes tell you and what the arbiters of truth tell you. And so this creates, particularly on the right, increasing distrust of our institutions and distrust of expertise and distrust of science and distrust of the news media.
American public and the public generally looked at that and said, wait, you're not shocked by this at all. You're the ones in the room with him. You're on the plane with him. You're at all of his campaign events. You see him behind the scenes. And not surprisingly, we've seen a spate of stories over the past 2 weeks that have basically said what we all knew, which is that they knew for months, they knew for years that he was in a state of severe decline. Olivia Nuzzi's piece from New York Magazine being the most obvious case of this. But now, again, when people see this thing, you can't unsee the fact that there were people who knew about this for 2 years and kind of covered it up, and then it exploded, and there's no denying it this time in the way that there was about any of these prior sort of fibs that the media had been telling.
Well, with the possible exception of the White House press corps, I mean, his inner circle kept him increasingly away from the press, which I criticized all the time. I've covered him for 35 years. I probably know him better than anybody at Fox. And I only saw the deterioration and confusion that everybody saw when watching on TV. In other words, it isn't like journalists got to hang out with the president. He was kept in a bubble.
So Mark Halperin saw clearly Joe Biden's cognitive vacant state back in 2018. And conservatives generally saw Joe Biden's checked out cognitive state certainly by 2020.
I mean, that's true, but with the exception of the White House press corps is a pretty solid exception there. There are a lot of people in the White House press corps, and it turns out that Joe Biden was going to events, and behind the scenes, he was meeting reporters at these events sort of in passing, and they could see that he was sort of glassy-eyed and slack-jawed, that he wasn't all there. This was perfectly obvious in bits and pieces everywhere, and not only that, there was an overt attempt by members of the media to proclaim that any focus on this was somehow out of bounds. I mean, the cheap fakes scandal was 3 weeks ago. Okay, that was not 5 months ago. That was not 2 years ago. That was 3 weeks ago when the White House was trotting out this line that all of these videos were cut out of context and that actually the president was doing just fine. And then as soon as the debate ended, the New York Times put out a piece citing exactly the same videos as evidence that Joe Biden had been in a state of decline for weeks, months, if not years. And so, again, the sort of shock that we're seeing right now feels like Captain Renault in Casablanca, that they're shocked to find there's gambling been going on here. It's like, well, you're not really shocked. I think that what the media have been shocked by is the fact that Joe Biden's campaign was incompetent enough to put this on full display. That's the part that I think shocked everybody.
Yeah, well, one of those...
So the most important reporting being done on this story comes from Axios, particularly Alex Thompson. But the two blokes who run Axios are Mike Allen and Jim Vanderhey. They have a long, prestigious track record in American journalism. They're centrist to center-left, and the savviest political followers are just constantly refreshing on Axios. And so the most important reporting is consistently coming from Axios, including today. And they note we're in uncharted historic waters. We've got President Biden and the Biden family saying that nothing except an act of God will persuade Joe Biden to quit his re-election campaign. But outside of Joe Biden's family, you've got a fast-growing number of Democrats who are praying for and plotting a more earthly intervention, right? They want everyone from the Obamas to congressional leaders to beg Joe Biden to drop out by this Friday, right? This is the consensus among the Democratic elites, right? And both sides seem to be 100% committed to their position. So both plan fierce public and private campaigns to see who buckles, right? So Democratic lawmakers have gone from shock last Thursday night to sadness to madness, right? They're absolutely infuriated by the Biden White House, and they were deflated by Joe Biden's ABC interview. They believe there's absolutely nothing that Joe Biden can do. So can the Biden family maintain their narrative in the face of nearly universal opposition, right? It's really hard to maintain your narrative if nobody else supports you, right? Every single person not named Biden, not paid by the president, recognizes how deep of a hole he is in, right? David Axelrod posted an opinion piece Saturday, denial, delusion, defiance. We have other members of the elite news media, Dan Balz of the Washington Post, talking about how Joe Biden is operating in denial. We're learning that major donors are quitting the party, right? And now big donors and key constituents are giving grave concern about Joe Biden's mental acuity. The story is breaking through into normal America. One swing state lawmaker says that monthly forum back home is usually consumed by community issues. Now all anyone wants to talk about is Joe Biden's age. Right? Dozens of House members and senators are very close to speaking out publicly or signing letters demanding that Joe Biden sit down. Right, this afternoon, House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries will hold a Zoom call with ranking members of committees of the House of Representatives. There's the thinking that Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi might have the stature to tell Joe Biden that it's over. Top Democrats hope Biden leaves by Friday because the rush of events will soon soak up whatever attention Americans will give the news as the summer wanes. Right, if Biden were to endorse Kamala Harris, she'd need time to ramp up and pick a running mate. If Joe Biden doesn't anoint, there will be an absolute frenzy among governors and ambitious Democrats to try to win the nomination at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Every day that goes by that Joe Biden does not agree to step down is a disaster for the Democratic Party. All right, something's got to give. Let's hear a little bit more here from Howard Kurtz and Ben Shapiro.
This is the.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I didn't mean to interrupt you. One of those videos with Obama leading his former vice president off the stage was not touched in any way. But let me turn to this. How much did the rise of Donald Trump, the overwhelmingly negative coverage of Trump, which seems only to help him, and his attacks on the media as enemy of the people contribute to this plummeting decline in trust?
Well, I mean, if you look at the statistics, the actual plummeting decline in trust began during the Obama era, not during the Trump era. So I've said many times that a lot of people are very angry at Donald Trump about his impact on American politics. They suggest that he's the person who did sort of the chief damage to the media. But that's obviously untrue by the polling data. If you look at the Gallup trust polls in the mainstream media, that's been declining since early on in the Obama era, and it really has.
And Elliot Blatt says, go with your gut. You want to understand the world? Go with your gut. All right. Intellectualism is for the gloopy ones. Well, sometimes your gut is right and sometimes it's wrong. There are some situations where you should go with the expert consensus, and the other times you should side with the wisdom of the people. Right. So it depends on the situation.
Never recovered. It went from about 50% at the beginning of Obama's term down to about 32% prior to even this last couple of weeks.
Right, but you had a president who was constantly attacking the media, which he had every right to do, and it was a sort of part of the running theme of that presidency.
But that was nothing new. I mean, if you recall back during the 2012 primaries, Newt Gingrich, to loud rounds of applause from people like me, was attacking the press specifically because during the Obama era, there was a reorientation of the press away from the idea that they were to hold truth to power and toward the idea that Barack Obama was a great light bringer who was to be sort of massaged into acceptability by the press at every available turn. And because of that, there was this widespread perception that the media had become a Praetorian guard for Barack Obama, that they weren't even before that for other Democrats. And I think that Trump is a reaction to that. Trump, as I've said many times, is sort of the coroner of American politics, not the murderer himself.
Now, but the media at times have been sharply critical of the Biden presidency, the deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan, presiding over an open border that took many months to gain traction. So it's not like it's all one-sided, and it's not like you were supporting him before.
No, I think that what you saw in some of these cases, the border in particular, was sort of people arriving late on the scene. So the media, for the first few months, basically denied anything was happening at the border, downplayed it. And then, of course, as it became undeniable, then you have to cover it. And I think that's one of the things you're seeing.
So philosophically, the most interesting part of this story for me is how liberal speech codes and the valorization of moral categories such as ableism and ageism blinded liberals to reality. While conservatives who did not share the liberal hero system, it was just obvious to them that Joe Biden was senile. So Jim Vanderhey, Mike Allen write for Axios yesterday, it is a fair conservative critique that many reporters ignored obvious signs of cognitive decline. There were many early signs. Biden rarely did tough interviews. It was almost always friendly questions on friendly terrain. And the denials from the Biden administration that he's in cognitive decline strain credibility and look ludicrous, right, in retrospect. So liberals were blinded, fascinating, by their own speech code. And part of this speech code is that you're not allowed to say that someone's senile. That automatically places you in the category of a bad person, a barbarian, not part of the elite, not part of the anointed. You're outside of polite society if you say that Joe Biden is senile. But is that not the first word that rises to your lips? Is it much more natural to say Joe Biden is senile than to say Joe Biden is experiencing cognitive decline? isn't it more natural and healthy and realistic to say homeless, right, rather than people who are experiencing homelessness? Isn't it more natural to say illegal alien rather than undocumented alien, someone who's just forgotten their documents, or someone who's in the country illegally, right? You normally naturally would say illegal aliens. So because conservatives don't have this liberal restriction on vocabulary, there are vast parts of reality that conservatives have a much easier time being frank and realistic about, right? Liberals want to stigmatize frank and easy discussion of group differences, that different ages have different gifts, that different sexes have different gifts, that different races and ethnicities and religions tend to have different gifts. So back in January 6, 2022, Edward Luce wrote for the Financial Times. And the Financial Times, about the most prestigious English language publication in the world today, probably either exceeding, matching, or just below the New York Times. And so January 6, 2022, he wrote, "On no topic is the bifurcation of America's media more evident than that of the president's age. To the conservative media world, right, Joe Biden's imagined senility is a staple. Republican figures routinely call for him to take cognitive tests. The term dementia is bandied about. By contrast, the closest traditional outlets have come to addressing Joe Biden's age as an issue as a spate of reports since the low ratings of his Vice President Kamala Harris. So for the liberals, it is as if openly acknowledging Biden's advancing years will validate the right-wing conspiracy mongers. Well, it turns out the right-wing conspiracy mongers were right.
Right now is now Biden's decline is undeniable, and so the media now have to cover it because it's totally undeniable. But that shouldn't be the job of the media. The media should be first on the scene, not last on the scene. It shouldn't be some rando Twitter account that's covering the news, and 6 months later, the media are like, hey, by the way, that rando Twitter account, turns out he was right. It should be the media. They're the ones with the most access, of course.
All right. Just briefly, Ben, can the media rehabilitate themselves and avoid what you call in the piece the ash can of history?
I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them to do so. You know, maybe they can do that if somebody, except for Biden, appears for the rest of the race. Let's say that Kamala Harris becomes the new nominee and Biden steps back. They would actually have.
Yeah, of course they can rehabilitate themselves because everyone's got blind spots, right? Conservative intellectuals and pundits did terribly with regard to COVID compared to their liberal elite peers. Every group's got blind spots, right? Every individual's got blind spots. Of course they can rehabilitate themselves, but rehabilitate themselves with regard to whom? Right? It's not as though the news media is going to receive universal acclaim no matter what it does, right? The news media's reputation will vary depending on the demographics, right? Conservatives will have suspicion of the news media and of science and of expertise as long as these categories are dominated by people on the left.
They have to cover Kamala Harris critically, which is something they're going to have a tough time doing given the fact that so many members of the media overtly would support Kamala Harris in the face of a new Donald Trump presidency.
Okay, I understand the challenge. I'm certainly wouldn't argue that the trust has declined for many years. I think there are many reasons, but it's great to have your point of view. Ben Shapiro, thanks very much for joining us this Sunday.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, why Karine Jean-Pierre is grappling with a very angry press room.
Real Estate Professionals Trust.
Come on, I'm trying to run a show here.
The White House briefing erupted with outrage.
So why is the news media so angry? Because they're humiliated, right? That is why you've got this intensity of reaction, because the news media doesn't like being exposed and humiliated, just as like virologists would be humiliated if it turned out that the origins of coronavirus was a lab leak, right? The whole profession would drop in esteem. And now the whole profession of journalist, right, political journalist, is dramatically dropping in prestige because it looks as though the White House press corps in particular has engaged in a massive cover-up, something that has put the safety of the republic at risk, because they've covered up the declining and obvious nature of Joe Biden's senility.
Questions for Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre after the president's abysmal debate performance.
Is anyone in the White House hiding information about the president's health or his ability to do the job day to day?
Absolutely not. Pelosi said it's a legitimate question to ask if this is an episode or is this a condition. Which one is it?
Well, what I can tell you is that he had a cold and a bad night. I would not see this as an episode.
Are you being straight with the American people?
So are you saying that the majority of Americans are misguided and that they just need to trust Dr. O'Connor and take him at his word? I have engagement with the president pretty regularly. What I see is a strong, resolute president who's always willing and able to work on behalf of the American people.
Joining us now from outside Philadelphia, Jackie Heinrich, senior White House correspondent for Fox News. Jackie, there was much more of that. Why do the reporters in that briefing room sound so angry and aggressive in their grilling of Karine Jean-Pierre?
Well, Howie, I think that, there's this broad feeling that we've not been allowed access to the president for so long. And there are a lot of reasons, I think, why that strategy has happened. I don't necessarily think it's because he has been secretly behind closed doors deteriorating for longer than we all know. I think that there's a bigger and maybe even more concerning layer there, which is that they have, as an administration, calculated that they don't need us and it doesn't benefit them to talk to us. They can go to a certain, zip code where they need to reach a few thousand supporters and go to a friendly podcast host there and get their message out and really sort of just give us handout video, which is why we as a press corps are always trying to advocate for more access. But when the Band-Aid is ripped off, you see him, for 90 minutes and all of the sort of arm's length comes spilling out into full view, people are concerned about, why haven't we been able to get our eyes on him up until now?
Right. And my own view is that I think many of them felt misled and even lied to. But this raises a point because earlier in the program, some of the critics of the president have said, the White House press corps did a horrible job because you all knew this. When you're on the road, how much do you actually get to see the president?
Not at all. What we see, you see. We see him from, the underwing of Air Force One as he's going up the stairs. He might come over and gaggle with us here and there. We might get a question shouted to him on the South Lawn as he's going to Marine One. He might answer a question leaving the East Room after he gives, prepared remarks from a teleprompter. But I also think the reason why they do that is that this administration, the people who run it, don't like when the president speaks off the cuff. You recall when he at the State of the Union mentioned Laken Riley's name for the first time, and he said that she was killed by an illegal, right? And then he gets the question at the underwing of Air Force One, do you regret using that term? And his answer was, no, technically, he's not supposed to be here. And then fast forward a couple days, and he's having an interview with MSNBC saying, actually, I should have said undocumented. That's because when the president speaks off the cuff, the answers that he gives don't satisfy big parts of the base that they're trying to keep in line. So this is a very highly choreographed administration.
So obviously referring to someone who is in the country illegally as undocumented is a euphemism, right? What documents are they missing? They're in the country illegally. It's like saying that stealing from stores is just undocumented shopping. So when you use euphemisms for reality, all right, it affects your thinking because we think in terms of words. And when you adopt these restrictive speech codes, you will think less and less clearly. That which you're not allowed to say out loud, you will increasingly not even think to yourself. And that's why everyone's got their blind spots, because everyone's got something that is sacred. And when you've got something that is sacred, right, you're not able to think clearly on that matter. And that's why we all think more clearly socially when we share what we think and then hear what other people think. And we can have our blind spots, brought to our attention, and we can recognize, flaws in our own perspective.
And there's a lot of reasons why they haven't let us close to him.
Right. You had an exchange with Karine Jean-Pierre that got a fair amount of attention. Let's take a look.
How is it that the president was still tired 12 days after returning from Europe, had a cold, but then went to the Waffle House, and then the following day staged such a huge comeback that he gave those North Carolina remarks? Like, help us understand.
Have you had a cold before?
Of course I've had a
Okay,
cold before.
so you probably, well, come on.
What was your reaction to that? And also that she keeps sticking to the talking point that, behind the scenes, the president is very cogent and energetic.
Well, the timeline just absolutely doesn't make sense. He'd been in the U.S. recovering for 12 days from his 2 foreign trips. He was at Camp David doing 6 days of intensive debate prep with 16 advisors all around him. And then all of a sudden, goes to the Waffle House and while he's sick, and then stages this recovery and gives these amazing remarks to North.
So Jackie Heinrich was the recipient of Tucker Carlson's wrath. So when she would report after the 2020 election in November that there wasn't any evidence to support Donald Trump's claims of massive voter fraud, right? Tucker Carlson sent these irate emails saying that she should be fired. She's destroying our popularity with our viewers. And he wanted her fired essentially for telling the truth, right? He castigated her for telling the truth. Well, Tucker Carlson somewhat bent the knee to the popular narrative that was bogus, that voter fraud played an important role in Donald Trump's defeat.
Carolina, it doesn't make any sense. But I think that, when they have an answer that they want to give us, they stick to it. As we saw with the whole cheap fakes thing, they seized on an opportunity.
Whoa, I got my first super chat on Rumble. My God, Josh Randall, $10. Thank you so much. Hello, Luke. Just some dono love from your old friend. Blessings. Wow. Very excited to get my first super chat in a long time since I had my various YouTube channels demonetized, and I just given up trying to keep up with YouTube's rules for monetization. I do keep up with YouTube's rules for staying on the platform, and I think I have so internalized them that I think even in my daily speech, how could I not be affected by YouTube's rules that I've internalized to appear on their platform? So I'm sure even my private speech has become sanitized by YouTube's rules, because I think that's good for me in that it presents a tremendous cognitive challenge to strive to say that which is true without breaking YouTube's rules for the platform. It's a challenge. It's like playing tennis with the net up versus playing tennis with the net down, right? Playing tennis with the net down is easier, but it's not as challenging. And I have internalized a lot of YouTube's rules. And so I tried to frame things in a way that's more socially acceptable so that wherever I go, right, I have less fear of being violently and viciously confronted. In furtherance of what I regard as a noble ideal, I want to try to do good in the world, not just feel good. And so I try to present ideas that are palatable to the widest possible audience and to reduce the chances of unnecessarily giving people offense. But it does come at a cost, right? I convey less clarity, right? I'm less visceral. I get to be less authentic because I've so internalized YouTube's rules. So I've become the reflexive, buffered personality that characterizes the Enlightenment left-wing liberal intellectual to some degree by internalizing YouTube's rules for appropriate speech on its platform.
To say any media that you see where the president appears in a negative light, that is potentially even the product of artificial intelligence, that she used deep fakes, and the White House never corrected that. I think that they have seized on sort of an opportunity when the New York Post used that cover, which was zoomed in and misleading, to cast any video, including pool video. I heard you talk about it earlier.
And when we internalize this censorship, it affects how we think. Right, things that we're afraid to say out loud because they would just so dramatically operate against our own best interests could completely ruin our lives, not just ruin our lives, but ruin our families, damage our community, right? By internalizing this censorship, it makes clear thinking more difficult. But everything comes with a trade-off.
This was, the Juneteenth event was shot by the pool.
Right.
That was, somehow manipulated. It wasn't. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to wrap by saying I would also point out they haven't released the medical records, only a summary. They haven't made the White House doctor available for interviews.
Right,
the Supreme Court handed Donald Trump a major victory by ruling a president has absolute immunity for official acts while allowing presumptive immunity for acts that could be challenged, but leaving that unclear.
I think that it is a brilliant decision. It's a 6-3 decision. The left is going to go crazy.
The majority of the court fears what has never happened. And the minority of the court fears what they have already seen happen. in the Trump presidency.
The mass hysteria among the liberal media and Democrats is really quite overwrought. It's exaggerated vitriol. This was a common sense, well-reasoned opinion.
This court has said today that an American president is a king, an absolute FU to the founders.
This court will never say no to him.
The president should be allowed to perform his constitutional duties as president without fear that unscrupulous prosecutors will craft crimes out of thin air to arrest their political opponent.
Trump said in the Post, the historic decision by the Supreme Court should end all of crooked Joe Biden's witch hunts.
So if you're a regular viewer of this show, you would not be vulnerable to this kind of hysteria over the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, because you would understand, as I've repeatedly said on the show, that the President of the United States already has all the foreign policy power of King George III. More importantly, there's not a dramatic distinction between democracy and dictatorship, period. All right? There are ways that they're different, but all democracies contain considerable elements of dictatorship, and or dictatorship contain elements of democracy. All right, there isn't this clear black and white distinction, and it's one of the recurring themes on this show. And I refer to a 2010 paper in the Minnesota Law Review by 2 Yale University law professors. Right, obviously these guys know far more about the law than I do, and it states, if Americans know one thing about their system of government, it is that they live in a democracy and that other less fortunate people live in dictatorships. Dictatorships are what democracies are not. Dictatorships are the very opposite of representative government under a constitution. But this distinction between democracy and dictatorship is greatly overstated. We saw this during COVID, all these rights that we took for granted, such as freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom to go to school, to go to work, to go to worship in your church or synagogue or mosque, were frequently taken away or diminished. And all rights, right, can be taken away if the entity that is sovereign decides that we're in a state of emergency, and the state of emergency doesn't even have to be real, right? So a county health officer in California can basically shut down anything. Right, every county in California, there are over 50 of them, have a health officer in charge, and they can shut down any public gathering, any business, any house of worship. They have that broad power. They can halt life as we know it if they believe there is a threat to the public health. So this power is already obviously there in our democracy and in any democracy, right? You could not have a democracy that functions through all situations if there was not the ability for the democracy to turn into, at least temporarily, a dictatorship, right? So the reason for the taking away of rights and for the imposition of a dictatorship is always that we're in a state of emergency, and sometimes this state of emergency is vastly exaggerated. Sometimes it has no basis in reality. But if you can get the law enforcement and the elites to go along with your decision, then you are sovereign, right? So Carl Schmitt said the ultimate goal of dictatorship is restoring the status quo, but dictatorship always lurks in the background. It's always waiting to emerge and to transform any existing political order. So it's not like there are only democracies and dictatorships, right? All forms of government contain elements of dictatorship, elements of democracy, elements of oligarchy, elements of socialism, elements of capitalism, right? So no matter how well-designed a constitutional system you might have, right, you will always have situations that will threaten the survival of your constitutional system. And someone who is sovereign will always be able to escape the confines of a constitutional system and make exceptions to it. So who is the sovereign? He who decides the state of exception. And claims of an emergency are the standard cause, the standard justification for creating dictatorships. So in 2009, President of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, placed the entire country under a state of emergency because of a potential swine flu epidemic, right? This concentrated political power in his hands, right? He authorized his health secretary to inspect and seize any person or possession, to set up checkpoints, enter any building or house, ignore procurement rules, break up public gatherings, close down entertainment venues, and that this situation would continue for as long as the emergency lasts. Right? So pretty much any person in charge when combating what they see as a grave threat to society, right, can usually get approval for suspending the most basic of rights. Right? Latin America has a long history of using states of emergencies as ploys to return to authoritarianism. On the other hand, Nikita Khrushchev was commendably cautious regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that cost him his job, right? So there was a degree of democratic accountability that cost Nikita Khrushchev his job as the leader of the Soviet Union. John Yoo, a law professor at the University of California and author of the Torture Memos, argued that despite American objections to King George III, the President of the United States enjoys all the powers possessed by the English monarch at the time of the American Revolution with regard to the use of military force. So Carl Schmitt's notion of the sovereign, he decides a state of exception, right? The sovereign is whoever can successfully define something as a crisis and then do whatever he thinks necessary to meet the crisis. So the Democrats have been running for the last 8 years with the theme that democracy is on the ballot. And so their own rhetoric has blinded them to the more complicated nature of reality. At the same time, Democrats have been running against Republicans with the idea that democracy on the ballot. The Democratic Party has consistently rigged its own primaries for presidential nomination in 2016 in favor of Hillary Clinton, in 2020 in favor of Joe Biden, 2024 in favor of Joe Biden again. Right? They have rigged their own primaries to create their own aims. So most sides in politics will be willing to override democratic norms if they see an advantage, just as most countries are willing to break international law if they believe that is necessary for the survival of their own country.
It's against me, proud to be an American. Biden, after settling for a statement, made a late decision to go before the cameras that night and took no questions.
So now the American people have to do what the courts should have been willing to do, but will not. The American people have to render a judgment.
So it's hard on the face of it to see the Democratic Party as primarily motivated protecting democracy. So I've always thought of them as primarily trying to protect the primary institutions of democracy in this country, including the Supreme Court. It's quite unprecedented and weird to see politicians coming out condemning the Supreme Court like this. The President of the United States, right, making a public national address to condemn a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, right? Is that not an attack on one of our key institutions?
About Donald Trump's behavior.
We're back with the panel. Molly. Absolute win for Donald Trump, but brought impassioned dissents from the three liberals on the court that the president is now above the law.
You know, we've never in the history of this country had one political party use the courts to go after a political opponent. And so because of that hubris and because of that zealotry, they really did get a pretty strong pushback from the court. They clarified something that had previously been somewhat ambiguous on presidential immunity. They also said clearly that the Department of Justice is not, in fact, independent of the.
So if you're saying that the Department of Justice is independent from the president, all right, you're taking power away from democracy and putting it in the hands of experts. You're having a replacement of democracy with expertise. And that has been a steady trend in democracies and national politics in the Western world since the 17th century, when you had this devastating 30-year war between Protestants and Catholics in Germany. As a result of that, you had the development of political systems in Europe that tried to remove, to anesthetize, to sanitize the religious element of politics. And since then, you've had more and more of political decisions, right, removed from the realm of politics and placed into the hands of experts. So you have had often tacit agreements between leading political parties to not campaign on the issue of immigration. We're just going to turn that over to experts. And you have had a push to make abortion rights. Well, that's something that should be left to the experts, to medical doctors, but there's absolutely nothing in being a medical doctor that gives you superior wisdom to the average person with regard to the morality of abortion.
The president, and they also threw all of these other trials into doubt. This wouldn't have happened if this case hadn't been brought, and it really shows the lack of wisdom involved with some of this hysterical use of lawfare to go after political opponents.
And he just had hysterical reactions on the part of liberals to this ruling. So his typical example from the New Republic, July 1st, the Supreme Court turns the president into a king. Right? The president already had king-like powers with regard to the use of the military. Right? The president can kill any non-American that he wants to. Conservative justices have ignored history altogether and created a shocking new precedent. The president is above the law. No. 5 members of the U.S. Supreme Court want to take us back to 17th century absolutism. So, I mean, prior to this ruling, executives throughout the democratic world already had the power of dictatorship available to them anytime they declared an emergency. I mean, doesn't anyone remember COVID? But when you are hysterical, you don't tend to think as clearly.
Richard, does a 6-3 conservative ruling look like a partisan gift to the former president?
Well, Judge Juan Merchan had been criticized for all of the various ways in which he had denied due process to candidate Trump. And so the issue with the sentencing now is that some of the things he did, allowing certain evidence in that he shouldn't have or disallowing evidence that he should have allowed in, that is actually going to cause a problem for him personally in a way that caused him to push this back. But it again just shows why using the courts to go after political opponents is not a good thing. We shouldn't do it in this country. This is what we associate with Russia or third world countries, not our country. And it's not enough coverage has been done about the recklessness and the problematic nature of what Democrats have done. And also the hysteria surrounding this Supreme Court decision has been completely unacceptable. I think all rational people understand that if you're going to have a functioning republic, you need to have some level of immunity for the president. And yet you haven't seen that in some of the media coverage.
So Trump is trying to get the hush money conviction completely thrown out under the Supreme Court. And the attorney and legal commentator. My biggest criticism of the SCOTUS ruling is that once you get beyond the absolute immunity for official acts, there's this murky area of presumptive immunity, such as Trump pressuring Mike Pence or state and local officials, and there the court punted and sent it back to the lower court.
And that's really what's so problematic, because there's 3 buckets here. You have the absolute immunity for the core constitutional activity by the president. Set that aside, that's absolute immunity. Then you have the second bucket, exactly to your point. So these judges have to go through all the evidence. And and this is the biggest issue that the judges are going to have to grapple with, which is most challenging, that any evidence that stems from those core constitutional rights as sitting president. We're talking about whether they're managing the Department of Justice. We're talking about whether they're managing the pardoning individuals, appointing electors. All of that, we're talking about this, that's absolute immunity, but now you're talking these outer perimeter. And any evidence that flows from those core constitutional issues cannot be part of any proceeding, any prosecution. And that's what's most challenging for these judges. That's what the judge has to determine when you're dealing with the January 6th matter. So when you look at that and you apply the SCOTUS ruling, the conversations that the sitting president had, President Trump had with the DOJ about the investigation, out the window, even though you're looking at the indictment itself, it mentioned those conversations with the DOJ.
Okay, the more prestigious your position, right, the more vulnerable you are to getting canceled, and the more incentive you have to discipline your speech. And so the more incentive you have to move away from your visceral reactions to what's going on and to instead anesthetize and remove the visceral from your vocabulary to create a minimum of blowback. So almost all speech codes come from the left, right? It's not being driven by the right. And so if you just Google insensitive terms, right, you're going to find all sorts of liberal suggestions on what constitutes insensitive and what constitutes acceptable speech. So I talked about the Financial Times, American columnist who writes about the United States, Edward Luce, writing January 6, 2022. He says, there's no reason to think that Joe Biden is suffering from anything more than traits that characterized him in younger decades, right? Nothing to see here, guys. such as foot and mouth disease, a tendency to talk too much. Neither of these is degenerative. Right? There's no reason to suggest that Joe Biden is senile or suffering from dementia. So like most of the liberal press corps, right, Edward Luce was clearly checked out from reality. And yet he's now making the rounds, right, of various shows, giving his commentary on this story without admitting how wrong he was. So the best analysis of this story is consistently coming from Axios and from Mark Halperin. And this is from Mark Halperin's Zoom call yesterday.
Will he give up the nomination? Will he give up the presidency? And if he's not the nominee, is it Kamala Harris or someone else? I don't know the answers to any of those at this time, and they're subsidiary questions.
So July 3rd, Mark Halperin said Joe Biden is going to stay as the nominee. By July 5, he'd shifted to say that he did not think Joe Biden would stay. But still, July 5, he thought once Biden was gone, Kamala Harris would be the presumptive nominee. Now he's shifting away from that position as well.
To the first question, what could cause him to change his mind? What the timing is, all of that. We'll get into all of that. But I don't know the answer. And my sources, as was true yesterday, are highly mixed. I have very smart Republicans and Democrats saying there's no way Joe Biden will be the nominee. I have one saying he will. Same on the other question. Some saying he can't possibly keep the presidency. Some saying he will. And some saying Kamala Harris will be the nominee, and some saying she won't. So let me run through on the first thing. Dan Balz's new column, a bunch of Sunday columns are up already from the Times and the Post.
So Dan Balz is a journalist in his 70s who writes a daily column for the Washington Post. He's the embodiment of the conventional wisdom.
Dan Balz's Sunday column, he frames it as defiance versus delusion. And that's a pretty good way to frame it, because the president and his family are still very defiant. They have no intention of changing course. They're doing everything in a way that is intended to keep the nomination, keep the presidency, and win the election. And increasingly, people are calling him deluded, not just privately, but starting to be publicly. I still anticipate a pretty big moment tomorrow night when Hakeem Jeffries does a call with his leadership, and then Monday when Congress is back in town. I think of the trajectory we're on by then, and I think it's almost certain that there'll be an explosion in one form or another of calls on him.
So Mark Halperin is doing a Zoom call, but most people, or many people, too many people, are unable to stay disciplined and to stay muted. So they wreck the call. All right, you just need one jerk who can ruin a gathering for 1,000 people.
Him to step down at a minimum from.
And the power of the individual to ruin life for thousands of people, all right, is an argument for authoritarianism, right? To do what you need to do to keep the public square safe and high functioning.
The nomination. Angie Craig, today, Congresswoman from Minnesota, became the first House member from a battleground in a battleground district and potentially in a battleground state now to say the president should not be the nominee. That's a big deal. The New York Times has a story that basically has quotes almost no one on the record, but matches to some extent my reporting from yesterday, that the expectation is that it's untenable that Joe Biden can go forward, that eventually he'll see that from, and that's an expectation from both Capitol Hill at the senior most levels in the Democratic Party, as well as at the White House. I want to read you 2 paragraphs from their story. I think I know who their source is because I think it's one of my sources from yesterday. One senior White House official who has worked with Mr. Biden during his presidency, vice presidency, and 2020 campaign said in an interview Saturday morning that Mr. Biden should not seek re-election. Again, this is a senior White House official who worked with Joe Biden in the Obama years and now. After watching Mr. Biden in private, in public, and while traveling with him, the official said they no longer believed the president had what it took to campaign in a vigorous way and defeat Donald Trump. The official who insisted on it.
So a little later in this Zoom call, Mark Halperin says Republicans investigating Joe Biden during his presidency have been a clown show. They haven't done it well. And in part, they haven't done it well because, as with the Hunter Biden investigation, the press was against them. That's why we all need other people to support our narratives, or it becomes increasingly untenable for us to have a story. So if no one buys into your story, you're usually going to abandon it. And because Republicans are frequently up against the news media, it's much harder for Republicans to maintain their narrative. So there's a lot of discussion among conservatives is why do Republicans who come to Washington to serve in political office, why do they steadily become less conservative? Because they're in an atmosphere that overwhelmingly denies the reality of their story. And all of us are affected by the people around us. And so if your narrative is receiving little support and great pushback from the people around you, it'll become increasingly difficult to hold on to your narrative. So that's why when conservatives move into positions that are dominated by the left, such as academia or the professions, right, they find it increasingly hard to hold on to their narrative. They have to keep watering down what they see as reality to fit in with liberal left speech codes. And then when you water down what you say, right, you then start to stop thinking clearly like a conservative, right? If you shut down what you're saying to make it more socially acceptable, you'll inevitably start to shut down your own thinking. And so conservatives are human, that they give into pressure. They bend their rhetoric to suit the ruling elite. And then as a consequence, it's more and more difficult for them to think like a conservative, just as many blacks who, passed in white society, made themselves acceptable to wider society. They've had to shut down many of their own tribal, racial inclinations and byways and ways of speaking, ways of behaving to make themselves acceptable to outgroups. And so they then get derided as inauthentic. And so to conservatives who rise to positions of power within dominantly left-wing elite circles, right, they have to restrain their speech, which then restrains their thinking, which then makes them less and less authentic as conservatives, right? They get neutered, just as many blacks have felt neutered or many gays have felt neutered when they passed in polite society. And the price for passing, right, was to reduce their authentic reactions to reality, to think less and less as a black man or as a gay man or as a conservative so that they can be more socially acceptable. Or Jews, right, who came to the United States of America, perhaps speaking Yiddish, observing Torah law, and then they became successful in mainstream American life at the price of their particularist observance and their particularist worldview. So the story of Jewish assimilation to American norms is a dominant one in all sorts of movies and novels, such as the Jessica.
Anonymity said Mr. Biden had steadily showed more signs of his age in recent months, including speaking more slowly, haltingly, and quietly, as well as appearing more fatigued in private. There's going to be a lot more of this, and it's going to come from people who, some of whom I think will go to the president before they go public and give him the opportunity to change his mind. Watch that closely. Maureen Dowd's column says, again, disappointed in her friend Joe Biden. That's going to sting the president, but it's not going to force him to quit. Ross Stout has a column that says, well, Trump survived in 2016. Biden's probably looking at that, and that's true that he is. Why can't Biden survive? Ross has 3 reasons why he thinks the Trump case is different, and they're very well reasoned and sophisticated. But I'll say again, if Joe Biden doesn't want to quit, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. These are, again, more of the reasons why we're leaning towards out today. David Axelrod has a new column on CNN.com. Axelrod Unbound, no longer worried about being called bad names by the president, basically says he's a deluded old man who should get out of the race. That's my...
Right, you become a lot more courageous when you get support for your point of view, right? If you're the only one maintaining your narrative in the face of overwhelming opposition from your in-group, it verges on the impossible to maintain your story. But when more and more people are coming around to your point of view, when you see momentum and trajectory on your side, then it gives people bigger balls.
Paraphrase. Some of you will be familiar with this story, which is going to have huge legs, of the people who want to say this is a Potemkin presidency in the Democratic Party. The 2 radio hosts who the president did interviews with, one from Pennsylvania, one from Wisconsin. He did the interviews on the 3rd. They aired on the 4th. The 2 hosts appeared on CNN today, and they acknowledged that the White House, or the campaign rather, wrote their questions for them. The campaign sent them 8 questions, and they chose roughly the same questions. CNN was smart enough to notice the questions were roughly the same. The hosts were insufficiently embarrassed to have taken their questions from the White House, or from the campaign rather, but that's going to already on Twitter and elsewhere. You're hearing a lot of Democrats, Republicans are giddy about it, but you're hearing a lot of Democrats say this is a joke because the president didn't answer the questions that well. He knew the questions they were going to ask, and he didn't answer them that well. Okay, there are two lines that Republicans are going to press very hard on in the coming days that are going to be a real problem for the campaign in the White House. Republicans investigating Joe Biden.
So there's a news story from Semaphore that supports the point of view of majority of the chat and the point of view in particular of Elliot Blatt. Right, this is something that Elliot Blatt's been saying for years, and I've been pushing back against him. My gosh, am I going to have to say Elliot Blatt was right? So this is from Semaphore. It's unclear, even to some inside the West Wing policy process, which policy issues reach the president and how. So major policy decisions go into an opaque circle that includes the White House chief of staff, who talks to the president regularly, and then these policy issues return concluded. The big exception to this pattern is foreign policy. So is the president even making policy decisions? Right, so members of the West Wing are surprised by the lack of policy briefings to the president, and they worry about the possibility of decisions being made without him. And this source says, I'm incredibly upset and scared for the country, and I would like to do what I can.
During his presidency have been a clown show. They haven't done it well. And in part, they haven't done it well because, like with the Hunter Biden investigations, the press was against them. The press didn't want to help them. Now the press is interested in these two stories too. So the incompetent Republican Party on Capitol Hill in terms of investigations is now going to have the wind at their back because they'll be working with reporters. One is, what did the president's people know and when did they know it about his condition? As most of you know, I've been writing about this for quite some time. It's been a conspiracy. The press has been in on it or allowed themselves to be intimidated. There are people at the White House claiming to me they had no idea. I'm being charitable and
wow, so this is Mark Halperin, a centrist, right? No right-winger by any means. He's saying that this has been a conspiracy on behalf of the news media to cover up Joe Biden's cognitive decline.
Extending them the presumption of grace and saying maybe they weren't in on it, but they do have TV. And they should have at least had some suspicions about what was going on with the president. And the vice president will take a lot of questions about this. Regardless of whether she ends up being the nominee, she's going to be part of this question of what did people know? How did they handle it? I tweeted a question.
Right. What did people know and how did they handle it? Those are the two famous questions that came out of Watergate. Right. Another reason why this scandal reminds me of the sacred, transcendent, holy realm of Watergate and the need for some kind of purification ritual after, that foul behavior by the Nixon White House. I'm just talking about the way it operated. I'm not making any definitive judgments.
Which is, given the president's condition, I hope his family had him diagnosed a while ago. There's a report that I wouldn't put out in public, but you can read it on social media and the New York Post, that some expert on Alzheimer's has allegedly been in the White House many times and met with the president's doctor. May or may not be true. But again, there's two possibilities. One is he's been undiagnosed, and the other is and they've engaged in a cover-up, or he's been diagnosed and they've engaged in a cover-up. Logic to me says it's the second one. But again, that's going to be greatly pursued.
And so from a liberal perspective, right, if President Biden was diagnosed and there was a cover-up to hide his diagnosis, that's much more serious because a diagnosis from a liberal perspective is something scientific. It's something medical. It involves expertise. And so liberals have a veneration for expertise and for science. Conservatives believe more in common sense than in expertise. And so do you really need to be an expert to see that Joe Biden has something seriously wrong with him? Or do you need to be a doctor to diagnose Chris Christie with obesity, right? Maybe what look like all these rolls of fat around Chris Christie, maybe they're just muscle. Well, from a conservative perspective, you'd say, obviously, Chris Christie is fat. Obviously, there's something wrong with Joe Biden. You just look at him walk, those tiny little steps that he takes, that blank face that he's been displaying publicly since 2018. Obviously, there's something significantly neurologically wrong with him. But from Mark Halperin's perspective, if Joe Biden has been diagnosed and that has been covered up, that is more serious, right? Because then you are going against expertise, you're going against medicine, you're going against science. Now, a diagnosis is not science. It may contain elements of science, but pretty much everyone is going to be the victim of a faulty diagnosis because there's a ton that is not scientific with regard to medical diagnoses. So what is the best word for describing Joe Biden's cognitive decline over the past 6 years? So for conservatives, it's senile. But senile is a bad word from a liberal elite perspective. So the liberal elite would prefer a word like frail. So doctors and members of the elite will tell you frail. That's a scientific and medical term. Senile is no longer a scientific and medical term. It's an outdated terminology, right? So how would you explain the mainstream media's reluctance to point out that Joe Biden is obviously senile? According to the Cambridge Dictionary, senile means showing poor mental ability because of old age, especially being unable to think clearly and make decisions. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, due to its negative connotations, use of senile relating to cognitive decline is now typically avoided in medical contexts, may be considered offensive in general context. So what renders it offensive? Because it violates the liberal elite hero system of careful monitoring of one's vocabulary to avoid giving offense. It's a way of showing that you're part of the anointed and you're not part of the benighted common masses needing education if you restrict your vocabulary to that which is acceptable. So healthline.com notes, senile is considered an insult, is not used except as part of archaic medical condition names. So the more accurate way to refer to natural changes of aging, especially those related to mental and intellectual functioning, is cognitive changes. Yes, and the homeless are just people going through a lack of housing phase, and illegal aliens are just people without the proper papers. So liberals do not like insensitive terms such as senile and illegal alien and homeless and gypsy, while conservatives tend to embrace these terms. So this additional verbal freedom enables conservatives to see and describe many parts of reality more easily than do liberals. Now, every group has its blind spots. Ties bind and blind, notes Jonathan Haidt. Conservatives have their share of blind spots. Right? Conservative distrust of expertise and big government place them at a disadvantage, with regard to those situations that are best managed by expertise and big government, and that may include the COVID epidemic. Conservatives also have a veneration of certain firsthand experiences over expertise, and that creates its own share of problems. So if you want the academic term for this, there's a 2011 academic paper titled Ears Wide Shut, Epistemological Populism, Argutainment, and Canadian Conservative Talk Radio. So epistemological populism, that would be the academic term for conservative veneration of certain firsthand experiences. So they do an analysis of Adler Online, a conservative Canadian talk show host, Charles Adler. How does this show function? So what is its epistemology? That means how do we know what we know? And so his perspective, right, borrows heavily from the rhetorical patterns of political discourses of populism, all right, to valorize the knowledge of the common people. So valorize, key academic term, epistemology, another term that academics love. So the common people, by virtue of their proximity to everyday life, as distinguished from the rarefied knowledge of elites, which reflect their alienation from everyday life and the common sense it produces. So this is the dominant prism that you get on conservative talk radio, right? The common people possess common sense, which is usually superior to the rarefied knowledge of elites who are alienated from everyday life. So the smarter you are, the more likely you are to live in an abstract world. And so we have a new study out that shows higher IQ siblings tend to be more left-wing than their lower IQ siblings. That the more intelligent you are, the more likely you are to be on the left, because the more intelligent you are, the more likely you are to live in an abstract world, and abstract hero systems, abstract notions of utopia are overwhelmingly left-wing because virtually all right-wing perspectives on the world regard human beings as not basically good, and therefore they're going to be less interested in utopia. So you want to live in at least an abstract utopia, almost all your options are going to be left-wing. So these are the bases of most forms of conservative commentary on the 100 IQ level, most types of talk radio, that individual opinions based on first-hand experience are more reliable as knowledge than those generated by theories and academic studies. And there are certain first-hand experiences that are particularly reliable, right? And emotional intensity is often an indicator of the reliability of opinions. And the common people are more likely to have common sense and the truth as opposed to elite members of academia. And there will be an appeal to common sense as the discussion ending trump card. So opinions armed with life experience, that's what we're looking for on this show. That's one of the many promos that you hear on Adler Online, taking you into a commercial break. And this is an excellent entry into epistemological populism, right? It captures the program's unequivocal preference for political sentiments that emerge directly from the crucible of both ordinary and extraordinary experience at the individual level. So it's these individual experiences which lie at the core of common sense and which get celebrated in right-wing talk radio. They are a counterpoint to the excessively ideological, intellectual, and idealistic politics of those who lack grounding in the real world. And Charles Adler says, opinions are great, but opinions armed with personal experience, those opinions are a whole lot better, right? Very typical conservative perspective. So knowledge grows out of an individual's lived experience. This is the type of knowledge that you can trust. So knowledge and experience become identical. So an individual's lived proximity to something becomes an index of their capacity to understand it, to care about it, and to develop valid opinions about it, and then to speak about it with authority. The more abstract the knowledge, the more abstract the reasoning, the less rooted in concrete individual experience, the more this knowledge is to be regarded with suspicion, especially when conclusions contradict the wisdom of common sense and practical everyday experience. And so the type of guests that you get in right-wing talk radio, the type of callers, and the type of experiences that are valid sources of knowledge, right, will vary, right? So you won't get as much reliance, obviously, on elite academic opinion, right? The urgency of various issues will be shown in the emotional reaction of guests and callers, right? You'll get a series of anecdotes confirming their common sense observations, and you will have the valorization of the common sense observation over theory. So has violent crime become a major problem? Is the criminal justice system being too easy on violent criminals, right? The wisdom resides with the people. And so Charles Adler says, man, I could just open up the phone lines and I'll hear about people who commit all these crimes and they simply sit in prison for a year or two. So as you get anecdotes piling up of firsthand experience in segment after segment, right, that will immunize listeners against countervailing theoretical and academic and elite arguments. And they will valorize the accumulation of anecdotes as a viable form of populist knowledge making. You'd see this with regard to voter fraud, right? You'd get people making the case for massive voter fraud in the 2020 election on the basis of this video or this anecdote. And as the accumulation of anecdotes would form the basis for Republican claims of massive voter fraud, and you would get dismissal of academic elite contrary arguments and reasoning and facts. So you'll get personal experience and broader social political questions just ricocheting back and forth in right-wing populist discourse, all right? And it's the personal experience creating common sense is the prism through which you can reliably find truth. So broader trends, abstract perspectives, theories, and studies are not allowed to challenge the generalizability of the individual experience. So Dennis Prager says, an academic study either conforms to my common sense or it is bogus.
The other issue that's going to be pursued is whether he can remain as president. And Republicans are going to be very aggressive about that. saying that he can't possibly be president, whether he steps down for the nomination or not. And again, the White House press corps now will, I think, ask the White House and the president that every day about whether or not he'll stay in. All right, those are the main reasons why I would say today, and where we are right now, the president is veering towards getting out. What's on the other side? Well, he doesn't want to get out, and he has no intention to get out, and his family is not abandoned him at all. So that's pretty big. And I continue to believe that the only thing that could get him out, except maybe an absolute collapse in fundraising, is Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer telling him he must get out. And we've seen that most prominently with President Nixon. Didn't work with Bill Clinton, though. Didn't work with Bill Clinton when congressional leaders said, you got to get out. So that doesn't mean that will work. And I can't tell you anything else that I would say with any confidence would definitely work. Paragraph from the same New York Times story, which is largely a negative story for the president, with lots of blind quotes from people basically saying, if he doesn't get out next week, I'll be going public. Some of Mr. Biden's advisors have suggested that the focus on the president's age and debate performance is only of interest to donors, the news media, and pundits. Anyone here who's gotten gas or gone to a deli or talked to their cousins this week knows that that's not true, but that's what they're saying. They said the campaign's small dollar fundraising remains strong, very important if true, and noted that many Democratic elected officials had publicly stressed their support for Mr. Biden and continued to campaign for him. That's true. The biggest thing for the president today is the Bloomberg poll. Bloomberg battleground state polls show the race close. Now, it's still disaster for President Biden. He's behind in 5 of the 7 battleground states. It's not a winning hand, but he's closer in those numbers. He's down 2 in the aggregate. It's not my favorite poll, but it's a decent poll. And I guarantee you that will stiffen the president's spine to say, why should I get out? My polls haven't collapsed. In fact, I'm closer than I've ever been in one of the few places that actually poll.
So Charles Murray tweets, I had the privilege of getting to know Arthur Jensen. He was a psychologist at University of California. He was an extreme version of the gentle scholar, completely absorbed in his research and oblivious to almost everything else. Give him a public intellectual task to perform, and he was formidable. His review of Stephen Gould's Mismeasure of Man is a classic of the genre.
The battleground states. If you haven't looked at the poll, I recommend it to you. There's some wacky numbers in there. He's doing better in Georgia than in Pennsylvania, etc. But leaving aside whether the poll's accurate, whether there'll be other battleground state polls that show that is a big thing for the White House. And I know the president's aware of the poll. He's doing a lot of fundraising appeals. I'm on that list. I get them. They're becoming increasingly populist, attacking the media, attacking the pundits. If they're right that they're raising money off that's a good sign for the president. I'm not sure that's true, but that's something to take a look at. And then they scrambled his schedule for tomorrow. He was supposed to speak at a union event in Philadelphia, and their picket lines that he doesn't want to cross. So they've added a different event in Philadelphia, TBD as far as I know at this hour. And they've also added a event in Harrisburg. So that's 2 events on a Sunday, not hanging out in Delaware, Pennsylvania, but still be interesting to see what those events are like. Now.
Okay, so how does right-wing talk radio in particular and populist conservative analysis in general decide whose individual experience should be given priority, right? Not all anecdotes fit the common sense conclusions served up by reigning conservative dogma. So how does the conservative talk show host distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate forms of first-hand individual knowledge, experience, and common sense? Well, you get a filtering, right? So talking here in academic terms about epistemological populism. Epistemology, how do we know what we know? So there are certain individual experiences that provide valid knowledge. For example, the police officer, his firsthand experience provides valid knowledge, but the firsthand experience of the left-wing social worker, that does not provide knowledge. The firsthand experience of the majority, right, white Christian part of the population, that's a valid type of knowledge. The firsthand experiences of racial discrimination and being victimized by bigotry by marginalized groups, that is not a valid type of knowledge. So certain individual experiences are elevated. They are the legitimate type of authority. So police officers and correctional workers, but not social workers, are legitimate sources of knowledge. right? The police opinions are facts. They are objective truth, not on the basis of any evidence presented, but because the police have the day-to-day level experience out there dealing with criminals that gives them a special automatic epistemological authority. So the persuasive force of this epistemological populism flows from its ability to activate and to apply the populist celebration of the people and of common sense, and to attack elites and to dismiss contending forms of abstract knowledge in academic surveys and political opinions. So you get the laudable voices of the common people and contrasted with the elitist views of academics, defense lawyers, and political progressives who represent just the special interests of criminals. And then we have a performative model in this discourse. So it is presented as an alternative to mainstream forms of journalism because talk radio represents the people. And in defining what is good for the people, it moves effortlessly between the political and the free market. So you get commercial success and the public good fused together. Whatever people want in commercial terms, as evidenced by market share, is what people need in political terms, right? Alternative perspectives that cut through the morass of the mainstream media, right? And it becomes represented as the same thing, a provocative and entertaining style of debate, highly emotional and passionate, strongly opinionated, simple, brief, confrontational, with a host who filters out ideas and modes of speech that the audience does not want to hear. So you'll have the host celebrating his style as an ushering in of a broadcast revolution in which the antiquated and outdated conventions of journalism and the bland, empty rhetoric of public relations are swept aside in the interests of energizing political discussion. Right, so you get to participate in a populist renewal of the public sphere. Public discussion and debate simulates what the host imagines occurs at kitchen tables and coffee shops of the nation. You get a frank, honest, confrontational exchange of opinion that's open to anyone to join the conversation. And this contrasts with the decayed academic elite discussion and arguments contained in academic papers. So for right-wing talk show hosts, the mainstream media's traditional commitment to balance, objectivity, and politically correct speech, right, have led to an anemic and boring public sphere in which unconditional respect for the views of others has completely emasculated our capacity and desire to make difficult but necessary political judgments. So these norms of journalistic objectivity have become the shelter of those whose claims could not otherwise withstand the scrutiny of common sense and reasoning and experience. Calls for balance and objectivity merely encourage an apathetic public sphere and allow the political claims of the elite to exercise disproportionate influence. So a style that is visceral, confrontational, aggressive, and highly passionate is politically valuable since it shakes people free from an elite-induced apathy and ignorance. So the elite can only rule, right, if you have a divided populace. So the more divided the population, right, the more likely it is that elites will dominate. On the other hand, if you develop a united people, that they can wrest back power from the elite.
People speculate a lot about will he step down, who the vice president, if the vice president or someone else would be the nominee. As far as I know, Joe Biden has not engaged in those conversations because he doesn't intend to step down. So I think on the second question of whether he'll step down, I don't have any idea. My gut continues to be that particularly if Kamala Harris is the nominee, it'd be very difficult to expect her to run for president and be president. So I still think he'll stay if he can, but I do believe the pressure will be pretty firm. On the question of who the vice president, if the vice president or someone else would be the nominee, I've changed my perception of that. Yesterday when we met, I was very bullish on her being the nominee. I thought that it was a very small chance it would be someone else. That's changed today. I still think she's the odds-on favorite, and I don't see anybody challenging her necessarily, but doubts are growing, and there are a lot of.
So you'll hear a lot of discussion on highly rated right-wing live streams and radio shows and TV shows that the high ratings are a tribute to the bold and aggressive style of the programs that does not bow to political correctness. So the populist genius of this type of low IQ commentary and talk radio lies in its ability to portray the logic of commercialism, right, treating political talk as an entertainment, as a politically virtuous invigoration of democracy. So the discipline imposed by the need to entertain a wide, mediocre IQ audience keeps political speech honest, accessible, authentic, and counteracts mainstream news media's counterproductive pursuit of diversity, balance, objectivity, and moderation. So by giving the people what they want, this does not lead to the decline of public discourse, but to its invigoration and democratic rebirth by welcoming the values and priorities of the ordinary people. So you get the market logic. The logic of commercial culture is an instrument of political democratization, right? So the people are put back in charge of the public sphere. And so the right-wing talk radio host serves the needs of the common people. He serves their interests. They are his top priority, and all the interventions he makes to discipline and shape political speech are simply designed to make the discussion more palatable and more democratic.
A lot of people, including a lot of donors and a lot of electeds who I've spoken to, who say, we're crazy, we're a suicidal party.
Can a Democratic nominee, whoever it is, win against Donald Trump without being serious on illegal immigration? Probably. I mean, Joe Biden won in 2020 without being serious on illegal immigration. I'm unaware of any leading Democratic politician who seems to be particularly serious about stemming illegal immigration.
Party, if we trade out a guy who we don't think can win for a woman we don't think can win. And there may be, she's got fans and the delegates are Biden-Harris delegates, but how crazy are we, people are saying to me, to do this, okay? Newt Gingrich did a tweet about basically saying how delighted he'd be to run against Kamala Harris. Going to call on the speaker. I think he's here to talk about that in a minute. We heard from Phil Singer yesterday here. He needs to not nominate her. And Andrew Sullivan has a column saying, basically sounding like Newt Gingrich on that question. Where's Barack Obama? Where's Nancy Pelosi? I think you got to continue to track what their points of view on this is. I think they'll be extraordinarily influential. Last thing I want to say is about Donald Trump. Okay, he has a Truth Social tweet that's just mocking of President Biden, mocking of Kamala Harris. He has some choices, and his team have some choices to make. The convention's coming up. The President Biden's press conference is supposed to be on Thursday. So when is the nominee, Trump's vice presidential nominee, going to be named? That's a big decision for him. If you think Biden is still in the race by Thursday, that's a choice he makes. And then the other thing is obviously their convention. And I'm hearing all sorts of things from Democrats about, well, Biden should get out during the Republican convention to step on the convention. I don't think we're in a world yet where anything's that neat when it comes to Biden world and how they're going to sequence things. So it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out. It's a very fluid situation, to say the least. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to ask Speaker Gingrich to talk about his overall view of whether Joe Biden can hang on and sort of the executive versus the legislative branch dynamic, and then about Kamala Harris and anything else on his mind. And then we'll call on some other folks. So Speaker Gingrich, if you could unmute, again, I think I remuted you, and tell us your overall view. And then I'd love to hear from you on the question of whether you think congressional leaders can get him out, and then Kamala Harris. Go ahead.
Well, let me say first of all, I'm glad you're doing this, and I think it's very helpful. I think your analogy with Nixon is wrong. When the Republican leaders went to see Nixon, they said to him unequivocally, if you do not step down, we will all impeach you. So there was a matter of force. Unless the Democratic leadership is prepared to say, we will impose the 25th Amendment, they have no muscle. They have opinions, they have prestige.
So Brit Hume, Fox News commentator, has been outspoken for years that Joe Biden is senile.
Republican Senator Ted Cruz is mocking state Democratic lawmakers who have fled to Washington in order to try to scuttle Republican election reform efforts in Texas at the State House. The Democrats are requesting care packages be sent to them, including soda and salsa, toiletries, and money. Cruz responded with a tweet asking no Miller Lite, the reference to a picture showing the lawmakers traveling to Washington on a private plane while surrounding a case of beer. Let's bring in senior political analyst Brit Hume tonight. Good evening, Brit. I wanted to talk about a couple of new polls. ABC Washington Post poll came out with some interesting numbers. One is the outlook on the country's future. This optimism, pessimism has really shifted in recent weeks. 45 optimistic, 55 pessimistic. And then you look at the approval rating for the president on specific issues. And obviously COVID, he's at 63% approval, but you look at crime, gun violence, immigration, down in the high 30s. Your thought on this turnabout?
Well, partly I think, Brett, it's the fading of the honeymoon period. You know, every administration starts out with high hopes in the public, and they tend to fade with time because not everything that's promised gets delivered. And in this case, enormous promises were made, a very ambitious agenda, only part of which has been enacted and much of which may be in trouble. In addition, of course, you have concrete things like the increase in prices pointing to a serious outbreak of inflation, whose duration we don't yet know. You have lawlessness on the border, which has been obvious and about which nothing of any consequence seems to be being done. And then, of course, there's lawlessness in the major cities, and that's something that people find frightening and do not want to put up with. Plus, of course, there's the sense that, that China's on the rise still. We don't seem to have checked China and so forth. So there's a lot of concrete reasons for this, I think, contributing to a mood. And of course, I should add to that, Brett, the fact that COVID cases are rising, that always frightens people. I'm not sure cases is the best way to measure that. But people, I think, are obviously worried about, new round of shutdowns and mask mandates, some of which appear to be happening.
You know, Brit, the president obviously receives some pretty good press overall from the media. But there have been a couple of answers recently at a town hall. Also, reporters question him where he's kind of snapped at them or said something where people weren't following it. There's a couple of examples in recent days.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. The question is whether or not we should be in a position where you why can't the experts say we know that this virus is in fact it's going to be, or excuse me, we know why all the drugs approved are not temporarily approved but permanently approved.
Are there people who in the Democratic Party who want to defund the president?
Are there people in the Republican Party who think we're sucking the blood out of kids?
You know, it's just some answers that media didn't make a big deal out of them, but made you scratch your head.
Well, that second one you showed there, Brett, was pretty dramatic, and the man obviously had lost his train of thought and couldn't recover it, and stammered around for a little while. These are signs of senility, which is a common thing in elderly people, and Biden, like me, is certainly elderly. But I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that this is the case. And I can't believe that people who see that, who are not already committed to him in one way or another, or committed against him, don't look at that and find it alarming.
But the liberal elite media did not find it alarming, right? This was just a theme on right wing.
At a time when their worries are increasing, and there's the polling showing that the pessimism in the country is increasing, and they see the president of the United States losing his train of thought and unable to blurt out a coherent answer to a question. I think people find it disturbing and makes them wonder about the future.
So, yeah, Brit Hume has been going off on this for a long time. Let's get him here 4 years ago on this theme.
Joe Biden has been all over the news recently. Of course, he's the front runner for the Democratic nomination still. Many of the stories are odd, some bizarre. Best example, his recent recounting of a fight he had with a man called Corn Pop. Nobody in this business has been covering Joe Biden quite as long or quite as closely as Brit Hume, so we thought it would be worth getting his take on what...
So Brit Hume wrote a cover story that I haven't forgotten in the September 1, 1985 issue of the New Republic, and it had the headline, "Shut Up, Senator Biden." And Brit Hume was talking about Joe Biden's tendency just to become a windbag.
What we're now learning about Joe Biden. So, Britt, does any of the recent coverage of Biden, the things the rest of us are learning, surprise you as someone who's covered him?
No, well, actually, yes. The gaffes, he's always made gaffes. Always has, and they've always been of a certain stripe. They sort of, he blurts out these things that are, you kind of know what he's trying to say, and he really shouldn't have said them. Like, you know, when he started talking about how, you know, Obama, he described him one time, you know, really articulate and well-spoken and all the things, and the subtext was obviously the last thing on the thing you'd expect a black man to be. Was,
exactly.
Remember that? And that was classic Biden. So was his comment that, you know, poor people are everybody as smart as white people. Remember when he said that recently? That's a classic Biden gaffe. And they're of a piece with the kinds of gaffes that he's been making since I've known him, which goes back to when he first came to the Senate all those years ago. More recently, however, some of the things he's blurted out have been of a different character. When, for example, he said that those Parkland students had come to see him when he was vice president. They didn't see him until he'd been out of office for more than a year. Now, that's a memory lapse. And when he's standing there in Keene, New Hampshire, and somebody says, how do you like Keene? He says, what a great place it is, and what's not to like about Vermont. That's a memory deal. And he's having more and more of those memory lapses, which are common and understandable and not unusual. But, you know, when you're that age, that's an issue.
Yeah, so for conservatives, it's just obvious that Joe Biden was senile, and yet that would just attract derision on the part of liberal elites. And a good point in the chat, people are incredibly calm that Joe Biden has the nuclear codes. On the flip side, will anyone execute if Joe Biden wants to fire them? Chat says, 1 out of 10 voices in my head say Joe Biden is sane. Dad, please don't drop out of the presidential race. I need that damn pardon. So what happened when Brit Hume said that Joe Biden is obviously senile? Right, July 1, 2020, Axios noted senility is becoming an overt line of attack for the first time in a modern U.S. presidential campaign. And the conservative website Red State publishes July 4, 2024. One journalist who has not been hesitant to assess Joe Biden is Brit Hume. Said in a Fox interview in September 2020, I don't think there's any doubt Biden's senile. PolitiFact did a fact check back then, declaring Brit Hume's assessment false, while noting the term senile is an imprecise term. PolitiFact contacted experts in the healthcare of older people for their take on Brit Hume's use of the word senile and its application to Biden. They said Hume's characterization is wrong. It's a shameful display of ageism and ignorance. The word senile may create a mental picture of someone who has stooped posture, is slow-moving, and cognitively impaired. I don't think any of these descriptors match Joe Biden's demeanor and vigor. Right? Use of senile is a pejorative descriptor and reflects unmitigated ageism. Oh my God, please don't engage in ageism. On the other hand, if you're in red America, anyone talking about the sins of ageism and ableism sounds like a retard. Right? Liberal fidelity to the virtues of avoiding ageism and ableism blinded them to Joe Biden's obvious decline. So I'm not someone who typically thinks in terms of fit for office, because it diminishes the realm of the political and expands the power of journalists in particular and of expertise in general to make important decisions for society. Right? It neutralizes the political. It's not something I think about because I don't venerate expertise or political office. The office of President of the United States is just one expression of the human urge for power. It's not inherently greater or lesser than other forms of human striving, such as running the 100-meter dash or being a preacher. I don't seek any moral or physiological requirement for political office because I don't believe the electorate needs minders and guidelines and experts to allow them to make decisions, right? Every candidate with particular skills will be particularly suited for certain situations and less suited for other situations. So October 23, 2020, Jonathan Chait wrote for New York Magazine, Trump's plan to make Joe Biden look senile disappeared without a trace. He's celebrating that. They're going to put him in a home and other people are going to be running the country, charged Donald Trump last March of 2019. Well, seems increasingly plausible, right? So conservatives embraced the narrative. They conspiratorially asserted that Democratic insiders secretly knew that Joe Biden was a drooling invalid but refused to say so. The Democratic insiders know Joe Biden has cognitive decline issues. They joke about it. They don't care. Glenn Greenwald asserted it is visible to the naked eye that the 77-year-old six-term senator and two-term vice president is in serious cognitive decline. Well, they were pretty much right. Trump invested his 2020 campaign in driving home the theme that Joe Biden is senile. But it didn't work. I put insensitive words list into Google. Yesterday, I saw such perfectly useful terms as long time no see, hard, unfeeling, soulless, unresponsive, callous, peanut gallery, grandfather clause, tactless, uppity, moron, and unconcerned. Those are all insensitive terms. All right, this is Newt Gingrich talking with Mark Halperin.
But they have no operating mechanism comparable to 1974. Second,
I'm sorry. Let me stop you there and just say, I think what the mechanism they'd have was the threat to go public and appeal to him. It's no force, but to appeal to him to say the caucuses will denounce you, and to believe that Joe Biden wouldn't want that. I know it's not the same as impeachment.
That's right. That's about, if you looked at a guy who said to Stephanopoulos, if God Almighty comes and tells me, it's a big jump from there, whatever Schumer may think of himself, to think that he and Hakeem are God Almighty. So my only point is, they may have an influence. You may be right. It may be that Joe and more importantly, it may that Jill and Hunter decide that that's right. Or it may be that in the Woodrow Wilson tradition, the three of them just say, we understand that you're weak, cowardly politicians worried about election, but we stand for history and we're not doing that. We're not doing it, period.
Yeah.
So I think the potential for Biden to survive by brute determination is greater than people think, unless it gets bad enough that there's a credible belief that they would apply the 25th Amendment. Second, what I'm surprised by, and this may be because I'm a Republican and I don't fully understand the dynamics of the Democratic Party, Kamala's not an advantage over Biden. I mean, the fact is, from a Republican perspective, looking at polling data, looking at her record, I mean, give me the person named the czar for the border that is going to have to try to defend millions of illegal immigrants that she theoretically was responsible for stopping, and give me the next 10 or 12 ideas that she's been involved in.
So, liberal devotion to avoiding insensitive language, right, blinded them to Joe Biden's cognitive decline. Many journalists, when questioned why didn't the news media report more aggressively on Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline, responded, well, it's a very sensitive matter to analyze somebody's aging. Right? To me, it's an obvious thing that should be talked about when it's in the public interest. So I Googled insensitive language to learn more about how the left thinks on these issues. So the Society for Editing has a whole long list of insensitive terms. So gypsy, right, should not use it. It's a racial slur. Dwarfed, little people exist. And using a term that reduces them to their bodies is incredibly insensitive. Grandfathered in. Right, this was a voter suppression tactic against black people that southern states used after the Civil War. Anemic. Right, used to explain a policy that is weak. It's insensitive because anemia is a disease. Avoid using medical terms as a value judgment. Crippled. Right, it's an outdated term for people who can't walk or have limited mobility. A lot of ableist terms are outrageously insensitive. Turn a blind eye to. Why it's insensitive? It tells people who can't hear or can't see that they're lesser because their senses are limited. A dark history. Right, dark history tends to frame issues as people of color existing in a predominantly white space instead of emphasizing the racism. Black and white issue. This framing puts black as bad and white as good. Now, there's no such sensitivity displayed by the elite towards traditional Christians, traditional Jews, and members of MAGA. Devin Delfino writes for writer.com. Using inclusive language helps to build trust and credibility, particularly with groups that are felt historically underrepresented or misrepresented. So here are 10 outdated words to cut. Addict, right? Instead say person with a substance abuse disorder. Non-white, person of color, elderly, senior. Homeless, people experiencing homelessness, sex change, transition, white list, allow list, or permit list, insane, just don't. Man hours, person hours, or engineering hours. Alcoholic, person with a substance abuse disorder. Right? What inclusive language do these elites want to use for those of us who consider their language policing absurd? Right, July 23, 2020, Jacqueline Howard writes for CNN, Biden and Trump, why doctors say attacks on age can be dangerous. So telling the truth about Joe Biden's and Donald Trump's obvious cognitive decline is dangerous, right? Telling the truth is dangerous. Right? It's very important that people focus on experience, on who the person is and policy issues rather than age, says this professor of psychiatry at UCLA. A lot of people assume that an older brain is not as good a brain. But that is not necessarily true. As people age, they become wiser. They have more experience to solve problems. Age should not be thought of as a single discriminating factor. It's dangerous to refer to stumbling over words on the campaign trail as a sign of mental decline. So having a senile president is not the danger. The danger is when we point out that the blokes running for president might be senile. April 5, 2022, the website France24.com publishes a video titled Misinformers Target U.S. President Joe Biden, 79, as senile. Misinformers target Biden's cognitive decline and ability to govern through manipulated videos. Oh my God.
She's more radical than Joe Biden. She's more unlikable than Joe Biden. And there's no evidence in polling data that she's an advantage. I mean, if the Democrats were truly desperate and wanted to win above everything, they would have an open convention and they would find some way to get to a governor.
Oh man, some great comments in the chat. I just found out that the term blockbuster is in reference to a bomb used in World War II. Talk about insensitive. Astonishing how our words are more patrolled than the southern border. This is basically liberal largesse majesté, right? Ruled by the elite. How does the left still tolerate white male Christian boomer leaders? Sleepy Joe sounds like the vodka, Botox, and Vicodin are all fighting for control of his brain. The hair-sniffing demon is winning. Donald Trump, fat, doesn't exercise, eats at McDonald's, not a good recipe for longevity.
Who was electable. I don't think they can do that. I don't think it's practical. But I think that the idea that somehow Kamala will do dramatically better, my guess is she'll do dramatically worse. And she will turn sort of a Mondale-like collapse by Biden into a McGovern-like collapse by the time her candidacy is done. That's again, just my view, although I am writing about it tomorrow. I'm glad to have a chance to share it.
Do you, thank you for all that. Do you find any of the other Democrats, any of the governors, for instance, to be formidable to the extent that you'd say, wow, if they found their way to nominating that person, it would shake up the race in a positive way for the Democrats?
I think that Shapiro and Bashir are probably the two most effective. I think that...
Yeah, I agree with that. Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, moderate Democrat, moderately religious Jew, and Andy Bashir is the Democratic governor of an overwhelmingly Republican state of Kentucky. So I agree. Those would be the two most formidable Democratic candidates for U.S. president. All right, I want to get to the philosophical foundations of the liberal left elite worldview that blinded them to Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline and led them to participate in a conspiracy to cover up Biden's cognitive decline. And so I turn to philosopher Ronnie Goldman's work in progress, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression. So he notes that all groups tend to define themselves in opposition to an other. So liberalism, no less than racism, sexism, and homophobia that it denounces, right, defines itself in opposition to another, the other meaning conservatives. So the anointed, the liberal left elite, reject the common sense of the benighted, right, the common people clinging to their guns and their religion, because its very commonness is an affront to their aristocratic identity, which requires them to systematically invert every inherited norm and understanding by the common people. So an elite liberal left identity presupposes a world that resists their prescriptions, a world too benighted to recognize their superior wisdom and morality, and thus all the more in need of their superior wisdom and morality. So whether it's the rights of criminals or the merits of avant-garde art, there's always a pattern of seeking differentiation at virtually all costs. So this is the traditional drive of aristocrats. They want to distinguish themselves from the commoners. So the elite will use amorphous abstractions like democracy, the politics of kindness, community spirit, the love of learning to be reconfigured to generate a new chasm between themselves, the anointed, and the benighted. And so you'll notice that the liberal left is always moving the goalposts because their political vision is really a vision of themselves in power. And the vision of the anointed must enjoy the passive acquiescence of the majority, and so it helps if the majority are divided up. And so a divided, identity politics driven populace is much more easy to police. So all you need is the passive acquiescence of the people. You're never going to get the lucid assent of the great majority. So instead you have this unaccountable intellectual class decreeing right and wrong. And so our liberal left elite have captured America's most influential institutions, including the media, Hollywood, universities, public education, foundations, government bureaucracies, and the courts. Except now we've got the Supreme Court, at least, is in the hands of conservatives. So liberal left elites use their privileged position to foist their parochial partisan values upon a silent, largely powerless majority of ordinary Americans. And where they're not able to completely disable democracy through the use of the courts and the administrative state, the residue of freedom will come too late when informal coercion can achieve unofficially whatever cannot be achieved officially. So the anointed employ preemptive rhetoric to prevent fair, reasoned, and non-coercive debate with their opponents. And this rhetoric will usually take the form of a seemingly innocent refrain. So when a progressive tells a conservative, you can't possibly mean that, right? The point is to stop the conservative arguments in its tracks, to assert the progressive's higher reality. Everyone knows, right? Likewise, another all-purpose put-down tended to broadcast that the conservative is a complete idiot. Or, you're not really, meant to suggest that the conservative interlocutor is really a cave dweller, a superstitious moron whose walnut-sized brain is probably stuffed with religious dogma. So our dominant liberal left elite see themselves as uniquely objective, inclusive, and thoughtful. They have an automatic social reflex that dismisses conservative opinions as mental or emotional immaturity, this mindless reptilian medieval instinct, unthinking fear and hatred that is easily recognized by more evolved souls such as themselves. So conservatives who try to argue things out in intellectual and academic life find themselves suffocated by an insidious and pervasive loathing of conservatives, right? The last socially accepted bigotry. So university solicitude for diverse group identities does not extend to those on the right. Right? Campus speech codes protecting the sensibilities of left-wing students allows these same students to label conservative blacks Uncle Toms and to label anti-feminist women mall chicks. Right? Students who believe that homosexuality is a sin can be charged with harassing their gay and lesbian cohorts. For pro-choice students who surround a silent pro-life vigil and chant racist, sexist, anti-gay, born-again bigots go away are engaged in protected speech. So liberals should put themselves in the shoes of the less fortunate. Think about the following thought experiment. Imagine secular, skeptical, and left-wing faculty and students confronted by a religious harassment code that prohibited denigration of evangelical or Catholic beliefs, that made the classroom or campus a space where evangelical or Catholic students must be protected against feeling intimidated, offended, or victims of a hostile environment. Imagine a university of patriotic loyalty oaths, where leftists were deemed responsible for the tens of millions of victims of communism, where free minds are prohibited from creating a hostile environment for patriots, or from offending that minority of individuals who are descended from Korean or Vietnam War veterans. Imagine that for every case that becomes public, there are scores or hundreds of cases in which the offender or victimizer, desperate to preserve a job or to gain a degree, accepts a confidential plea bargain that includes a semester or a year's re-education in religious sensitivity or patriotic sensitivity, seminars run by the university's Evangelical Center, Patriotic Center, or Office of Religious and Patriotic Compliance.
Whitmer would be effective. Those three, if I'm sitting as a Republican strategist worrying about a world that's much worse than the one we're in, those are the three names that would come to mind. But all of them have this problem that the first thing they have to be asked is, when did you know that Biden was incompetent and why didn't you say anything? The second thing they're going to be asked is there any major Biden program you disagree with? Because the fact is, which nobody on the left wants to admit, Biden's problems in large part are programmatic, not personal. His policies are largely unpopular. As you know, I do a project called the America's New Majority Project, which is available online. All of our data is public. On issue after issue, I mean, parents' rights to know, for example, is like an 84% issue. The teachers union opposes it. And I could give you 10 other examples where.
All right, so we had a book published back in 1979 that dissects our ruling class by Alvin Gardner, right? The culture of the new class exacts these costs, right? Because its discourse emphasizes the importance of carefully edited speech. This has the vices of its virtues. So in its virtuous aspect, self-editing implies circumspection, care, self-discipline, and seriousness. But the flip side of this is self-editing disposes one toward an unhealthy self-consciousness, toward stilted, convoluted speech, an inhibition of play, imagination, and passion, and continual pressure for expressive discipline. So the new rationality becomes the new alienation. So all these liberal left calls for watchfulness and self-discipline with regard to speech, right, produces a reflexivity and loss of warmth and spontaneity. So the liberal left elite have great suspicion of our native instincts and want to discipline and reprogram them, right? So this reflexivity stresses the importance of adjusting action to ever-changing patterns of propriety. So a structured inflexibility when facing changing situations, such as Joe Biden becoming obviously senile, creates a disregard of differences in situations and an insistence on hewing to the required rule. So I think this is a fundamental part of the reason why the liberal left media elite largely ignored Joe Biden's obvious senility. And a problem with these codes of political correctness is not just the diminution of conservatives' right to free expression, but it becomes insidious in that it obstructs the conservative to even form beliefs, to translate their true sentiments into clear statements of position that they can then defend without embarrassment. So we have a ruling class that has established itself as the fount of authority, and it's all based on habits of deference. And so conservative anti-intellectualism is an attempt to reverse these habits, to erode the social prestige that attaches to the rhetoric and airs of the intellectual. So back in 1989 at Northwestern University, you had self-evaluation consultants to facilitate its new student week. So the consultants would admonish the incoming freshmen that while they were not to be blamed for the customs and habits of thought they inherited from their parents and communities, they must now remake their lives, ridding themselves of the ugliness, the meanness, the narrowness of tribalism. At Montclair State University, residential advisors attended sensitivity training, where they were issued permission slips granting them permission to be imperfect with regard to homophobia and heterosexism. Because given the heterosexist and homophobic culture in which they were raised, their ignorance and bias were excusable so long as they were struggling to change my false, inaccurate beliefs or oppressive attitudes and learning what I can do to make a difference. So Kevin Williamson used to write for National Review. Then he was briefly hired by Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic and then fired for his strong views on abortion. He's the bald guy, very anti-Trump, but he's got a good point here. The left's organizing principle is control, and the possibility that children might be raised outside of its control is an existential threat. So institutions such as the free market and free speech terrify progressives because they are the result of arrangements in which nobody is in control. Homeschooling isn't for everyone, but every homeschool student, like every firearm in private hands, is a quiet declaration of independence. There's no accident that the people who want to seize your guns are also the ones who want to seize your children and insist they be educated in public school.
The left has just left the American people, and almost any Democratic candidate has to somehow be in the framework of what is an unpopular agenda, despite the belief in the left that it's actually what the American people want.
There are some Biden positions that are more popular. Tax increases on the wealthy, protecting entitlements, the infrastructure bill. So it's not. It's possible that a Democrat could
That's
run
right.
on
It's
those
not-
things, right?
It's no. But as you run campaigns, our side's not going to mention the three you mentioned. Our side's going to say, where are you in the following 9 or 10 or 12 things? And on most of those, and Kamala's on almost every case, worse than Biden. She's instinctively more radical. She's younger. She's California, not Delaware. So I think from our standpoint, we probably do better against Kamala than against Biden, unless Biden just totally collapses and becomes unacceptable. But in either case, I don't see any easy way to get past one of those two. I mean, the idea that you're going to get to a third person could happen. We're entering a period here we've never been in before. So I don't say it's impossible, but it's pretty hard to imagine how they dump both Biden and Harris and get to a third candidate.
Last question for you, Mr. Speaker, and again, love for you to stick around and chime in as you wish. Where do you think President Trump is on a selection of a running mate? Which names do you think are you still taking seriously?
I suspect in the back of his head he already has chosen somebody, but I also suspect that he reserves the right to himself to change whatever he's already decided. And I think that he's loving where he's at right now. I mean, I think the very fact that you can go for a week with Trump saying almost nothing, and that he's cheerfully giving up page one to his opponent tells you how much trouble Biden's in. And I suspect, I mean, my guess is that Trump will probably try to counter pick, but I don't know. I know nothing about this. I haven't talked to him about it in a serious way. My instinct is they'll wake up one morning, he'll have a gestalt, he'll suddenly say, yep, that's the right person. It'll feel right to him, and he'll pick that person. I suspect they'll be very formidable in their rollout, and that there'll be a remarkable contrast of stability and rationality compared to what is an increasingly chaotic Democratic Party.
If it's between the 30 people most often mentioned, Rubio, Burgum, and Vance, who would you recommend?
Well, I'd also throw in Youngkin.
Yeah,
I think my favorite would be Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia. To me, he'd be the best vice presidential pick. I also wanted to see him run for the Republican presidential nomination. Okay, so conservatives have consistently said that Joe Biden very likely not mentally fit to be president. March 12, 2020, conservative columnist Mark Thiessen wrote for the Washington Post, "It's fair to speculate whether Biden is mentally fit to be president. His socialist rival, Bernie Sanders, almost a year older than Biden, yet no one questions his mental fitness. By contrast, these are the type of reports you got from people on the left. April 7, 2021, Tara Law writes for Time magazine, ageist attacks against President Biden reinforce outdated stereotypes and hurt younger people too. So most stereotypes are true, which is why we employ them as a useful heuristic, all right, to economize our energies, to get a useful prediction of what's most likely to be true. And it just cracks me up that liberals use ageist, ableist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic as though these are real moral categories. And then she writes, experts say, right? Experts say is a favorite phrase of people on the left, or it's the equivalent of common sense for conservatives. So conservatives believe that most individuals have common sense and can usually trust what their eyes tell them, while liberals believe that common sense resides with experts. So experts say age-based attacks against Biden demonstrate how common ageist stereotypes are in American culture to everyone's detriment. So this is the barrier for the dominant media coming to the perhaps dominant story of the past 4 years, which is Joe Biden's steady cognitive decline. By contrast, here's conservative Newsweek columnist Joshua Hammer writing July 15, 2022, there's something very, very clearly wrong with the President of the United States. Even the New York Times read a recent piece titled, At 79, Biden is testing the boundaries of age in the presidency. 3 days later, Michelle Goldberg, a reliably progressive columnist, entitled her own column, Joe Biden is too old to be president again. November 2nd, 2022, conservative columnist George Will concludes that Joe Biden is senile. Biden is not just past his prime, even adequacy is in his past. November 19, 2022, New York Times publishes experts who have reviewed the available White House medical records said that so far Biden appears to be aging in a healthy way. Right? This is the dominant mainstream media liberal left perspective on Joe Biden's cognitive decline until the June 27, 2024 debate against Donald Trump. Former New York Times Ombudsman Margaret Sullivan wrote February 13, 2023, that George Will said that Joe Biden must either be senile or a pathological liar. I wish Biden were 20 years older, but right now he looks like the best bet to stave off a disastrous Republican presidency, and his record is impressive. Juliana Goldman wrote for Bloomberg February 16, 2023, by calling for cognitive testing of any politician older than 25, Nikki Haley is engaging in age discrimination, right? So we have this whole moral category of age discrimination thanks to our multiple civil rights laws that have essentially replaced our original constitution with a new civil rights industrial complex and constitution. Jacob Hess, February 28, 2023, writing for Deseret.com, how he's sick of people disparaging Joe Biden's senility. Says you have former White House advisor Stephen Miller said that Joe Biden should be assisted living and is not cognitively present. Podcasters like Joe Rogan saying he's so gone, he's got dementia. There are no ifs, ors, and buts about it. Sean Hannity, President Biden is plagued by his own cognitive decline. Does he fully comprehend and understand what is going on? And even billboards insist he's not fit. And in the view of this columnist, Joe Biden's 20-minute speech in Warsaw strongly disconfirmed these blanket condemnations. Well, these blanket condemnations were more accurate than the dominant mainstream media perspective. June 11, 2023, The Guardian, left-wing publication out of Britain, said, the notion that Joe Biden is suffering from cognitive decline or lacks the mental acuity to be president has become a fixture of conservative media for years. But Biden's physician has released a 5-page summary of his current health status, describing him as a healthy, vigorous 80-year-old male who is fit to successfully execute the duties of the president. So the liberal media would choose the side of Joe Biden's own physician, because after all, this is a doctor, and the doctor says he's healthy and vigorous, while on the right, the media has overwhelmingly said Joe Biden is obviously suffering from cognitive decline and lacks the mental acuity to be president, and the conservative media turned out to be right, and the liberal left dominant media has turned out to be wrong. July 29, 2023, Zachary B. Wolf writes for CNN, when is it not ageist to ask questions about Joe Biden's mental acuity? And by never providing any reasons to say, oh, this question about Joe Biden's mental acuity is legitimate, he's essentially saying that you should not question Joe Biden over his age. So Zachary B. Wolf and CNN consistently did their bit to protect Joe Biden from healthy scrutiny by ruling such questioning unethical and impolite. September 8, 2023, Mary Mitchell writes for the Chicago Sun-Times, Joe Biden's age isn't the problem. We are, meaning anyone who questions whether Joe Biden is fit to be president. We're the problem. Unless medical professionals caring for Joe Biden determine that he can't carry out his duties, our concern is just ageism, right? That's the classic mainstream media perspective on this. Unless you have medical professionals following proper protocol, caring for Joe Biden, who would obviously be disinterested and impartial and objective, unless they say that Joe Biden can't carry out his duties, any concern that you, lumpen proletariat, have is just ageism. Ageism is one of the last acceptable prejudices, so ingrained in our culture that we often don't even notice. But luckily we have the liberal elite, left-wing media trying to raise our consciousness to the dangers of the prejudice of ageism and ableism. Time Magazine, September 27, 2023. We have a column. American voters seem to be overly concerned about age and the cognitive and physical decline for Joe Biden that comes with it. The current debate over the impact of age on the presidential race has descended into ageism, which is a serious conscious and unconscious bias we all fall for ever so frequently. American Psychological Association has determined that ageism is one of the last socially acceptable prejudices. We are wasting the talents of many people above the age of 60, 70, and 80 because we unjustifiably deem them not capable of performing any job. As human beings, we start to decline from a cognitive point of view when we are in our late 20s, but typically experience more than compensates for cognitive decline. Joe Biden's legislative and presidential records speak to the importance of experience in American politics. Instead of endlessly debating whether Joe Biden is fit for a second term on age grounds, we should be celebrating that a second term would reflect the increasing diversity of American society in terms of age. The political debate over aging politicians has become polarized, is not contributing to making the nation stronger. So our liberal left elite overwhelmingly tried to rule out any questioning of Joe Biden's mental competency as immoral and impolite and unacceptable. February 9, 2024, Stephen Collinson writes for CNN, "Age and the question of diminished capacities as a person heads into their twilight years is a deeply painful and sensitive one. Many of the attacks on Biden by Republicans reek of ageism and come across as cruel." Well, guess what? You can have an attack that is ageist and cruel, and it still might be accurate and important. November 1, 2023, the AP reported, "To hear Donald Trump tell it, President Joe Biden is so senile that he doesn't know where he's speaking and feeble enough that others are making decisions for him." And it quotes one voter, 23, who attended a recent Trump rally. "Look at videos of Joe Biden, read into it. He's just mentally can't handle it." When you look at Joe Biden, he says things that are crazy. No, when you look at Trump, he says things that are crazy, but that's the type of guy I wouldn't want to mess with. Graham Wood wrote for The Atlantic, February 12, 2024, on fear of a senile president. "The presidency is not a math test. What are you guys talking about? Why are you so concerned about Joe Biden's mental acuity?" So the liberal media elite doing everything they can to rule such questions out of bounds. "Neither of the old men running on a major ticket shows any signs of catastrophic senescence. Many people think Joe Biden is senile. They now think with this Robert Hur judgment that he's a well-meaning old man with a poor memory, that this certifies their judgment. The document does not say what many people believe, does not say that Joe Biden is unfit to stand trial, just that he's forgetful enough to evade conviction on the basis of a particular utterance. So not a big deal." Special prosecutor report that Joe Biden has severe memory lapses. Jet Here writes for The Nation, February 12, 2024, complaining about Jonathan Chait, saying that senility should prevent someone from having control of nuclear weapons to extinguish life on Earth. Jonathan Chait says, if Joe Biden is controlled by advisors, is that unacceptable? If the advisors are making good decisions, Reagan was pretty senile, controlled by advisors. Nobody cared about the results. Michael Cohen says memory loss is not necessarily a factor in being able to do the job of president. But then Jonathan Chait says Joe Biden seems more female than Reagan. There's no aspect of the presidency other than communications that Biden has been inhibited from doing. Well, how do we know? The media, by and large, the dominant establishment, conventional, elite, mainstream, left liberal media, did not want to engage with the most cogent critique of Joe Biden, that he's simply too old to serve as president because it was too sensitive for their particular hero system. New York Times reported February 13, 2024, Joe Biden's voice has grown softer and raspier, his hair thinner and whiter. He is tall and trim, but moves more tentatively. He often holds his upper body stiff, adding to an impression of frailty. He has had spills in the public eye, falling off a bicycle, tripping. Donald Trump, by comparison, does not appear to be suffering the effects of time in such visible ways. Trump is big. He simply takes over. He has that kind of full charge ahead persona that correlates with being a younger, healthier, more active person. Joe Biden doesn't. He's different, and it doesn't work out well.
I think that I have no, first of all, if I had a real recommendation, it wouldn't be to you. But my observation, as opposed to recommendation, would be that whoever communicates stability is an enormous advantage in a moment of absolute chaos, as seen by the country.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, thank you. Stay with us. If you would, Mark McKinnon,
Sure.
I'd love for you to unmute. Thank you for all that. I'd love for you to unmute Mark McKinnon because I want to ask you some questions, if you would.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you for joining. Mark, you've spent a lot of time with politicians in dire straits. If Joe Biden said, Mark, tell me your most optimistic case for my chances of being reelected, what case would you make to him?
You know what I would do, Mark? This is a situation where somebody has to go into the propellers, and I say, Karen Hughes, you go. You tell him, because she would.
What's the optimistic case, though? If he says, Mark, I know you've got doubts about me, but how can I save this? What could he do at this point to save it?
I think realistically, Mark, the only thing that he can do would be to stay the course and just hope that something, unforeseen happens to Trump. I mean, that on any sort of glide path, barring some, unforeseen catastrophic event that happens to Trump, I think Biden loses. And the thing that strikes me as just a campaign operative is anticipating and trying to envision what the campaign looks like now after all of this. I mean, you've alluded to it on certain, in a number of points, Mark, but the sort of scrutiny that he was getting before the debate.
Like if it meant,
sorry, go ahead, Mark. Mark, hold on. We need to unmute you again. I apologize.
The sort of scrutiny, Mark, that he was getting before the debate, which is sort of general but not specific to all the things that we're talking about, is going to be so intense now that, I mean, we know that the debate performance was not a one-off and that there's going to be bad nights or bad days between now and the election. Even if he wasn't 81, there would be, but he is. So there's going to be a bunch of them. And it's just going to be a nuclear meltdown. And it's just going to be the most uninspiring, slogging, sort of lemming off the cliffs campaign that I can recall ever. It's going to be miserable for everybody involved. I think the people around Biden are already miserable.
So here's part of the liberal media consensus. This is on NPR, February 16, 2024. Ageism against Biden and Trump put older folks at risk. What would you do if I told you there's a whole demographic group that can't be trusted to work because they're unreliable, bad with technology, slow learners, and not a good culture fit? When I said that group should be incorporated into the rest of society, they should live in their own separate communities where the rest of us don't have to see or interact with them unless we choose to. Would your hackles be raised? It should. It's called stereotyping. So, ageism, very, very bad. NPR column. Then, Sydney Morning Herald, February 2024. Joe Biden is being consistently described by his political rivals and their supporters as senile, mentally unfit, despite having a clean bill of health. Now, this has escalated with the Department of Justice report into Biden's retention of classified documents describing Joe Biden as likely to come across as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. We shouldn't be attributing every mistake to someone's older age, seeing everything through a negative lens about aging, or leveling casual ageist remarks against Biden and Trump, like calling them bumbling or grumpy or describing them as well-meaning. That is a condescending description for one of the most successful people in the world. So you see the elite use the news media to try to stamp down frank, free discussion of Joe Biden's obvious cognitive disabilities. Then, June 27, we have Joe Biden's disastrous debate, and media coverage of Joe Biden's age explodes, right? So Joe Biden became unlikely to defeat Donald Trump, so the mainstream media now wants Joe Biden out of the race. So in the course of the first 5 minutes of the debate, the mainstream media went from covering for Joe Biden to seeking to dispatch Joe Biden. He's now become an embarrassment for their agenda. And conservative columnist Mark Hemingway writes for The Federalist July 1, the only reason anyone ever believed Joe Biden was up to the job is that they were lied to. Most Americans have always understood Joe Biden as being exhibiting signs of dementia before he ever became president. It's impossible to deny that Democrats and their media allies have betrayed and endangered America by spending the last few years lying to us about Biden's age-related mental competency. It's not just that the debate made it impossible to deny Joe Biden's cognitive decline, it's that the media's desperation to defend him is also laying bare the total moral and ethical collapse of mainstream journalism. Then columnist at Forbes, July 5, Regardless of President Biden's performance in last week's debate, saying he's too old to run again is wrong. Competency is not tied to chronological age. Well, in some things, it is correlating with age, right? Headlines that read too old to run for president perpetuate the ageist myth that competency is directly tied to age, which is inaccurate and misleading. The public has judged Joe Biden too harshly. Hadass Gold writes for CNN July 2nd. Biden's age was a right-wing talking point for years, something the White House was quick to point out to reporters, which may have turned off any serious investigation. The deceptively edited clips of Joe Biden from the G7 spread widely by right-wing media figures were made to seem as though he was aimlessly wandering off from fellow world leaders, when really he was just speaking to parachuters who just landed during a demonstration. The right-wing media was calling him senile from day one, and that wasn't true, one reporter says. So whenever you report on the age, you're in some way solidifying, giving credence to people who are acting in bad faith. Alex Thompson said on CNN the day after the debate, the White House response every single time it has come up for the last 3.5 years has been to deflect, to gaslight, and to not tell the truth. Then there was a thoughtful liberal analysis at the New York Review of Books website, July 2nd, by Fintan O'Toole. Political campaigns are embodied narratives. Right? The medium for the message is the candidate's physical and linguistic presence. Donald Trump's presence is looming, swaggering, and domineering. Right? And it personifies his insistence that America needs to stand tall and that against the forces aligned to destroy it. Right? He may be the first presidential candidate to draw specific attention to his own body. The corporeal Trump is almost ageless. He has arrested the ravages of time on his own body, just as he will stop the decline and decay of the American body politic. Joe Biden cannot do this. His political story is not one of time arrested, but of time renewed. He wants to evoke a sense of future possibility, a rebirth of social and racial justice, but his body is not in sync with this message. He's unable to exemplify progress. He is forced to play Trump's game by pretending to have stopped his own physical decline. So Joe Biden engages in these little running motions. The aviator sunglasses, the protesting too much displays of youthful energy are all failed attempts to do what Donald Trump is so good at, appearing ageless. But time will not play along. It's all too easy to look at a photograph of Joe Biden in 2020 and compare it to his present, more withered self. So in the most obvious physical sense, it is Donald Trump who has set the terms and Joe Biden who has allowed himself to be sucked into accepting them. Right, in 2020, the pandemic saved Joe Biden from the consequences of this. It wiped out Trump's advantage in physical presence. And Ross Douthat writes yesterday, Democrats see themselves as the party that trusts the mainstream press and academic expertise and respectable opinion. Republicans generally assume that these forces are biased and blinkered and out to get them.
And to have to campaign now knowing what everybody knows, I don't think we've ever seen anything like it. And it's just every day is just going to be, there will be no good days.
Yeah. Mark, last question. You right after the debate said basically you can't imagine anyone voting for Joe Biden at this point. That doesn't mean you think people should vote for Donald Trump, but you thought he disqualified himself. Did anything in the ABC interview rehabilitate him for you at all?
No, not at all. And I think that, I mean, I'll just say one thing. I mean, to say that first of all, to not have watched the debate as Al Gore did, not only watched, as you know, Al Gore watched the debate and he watched the SNL mockery of the debate, but to not go back reportedly, I think is malpractice. But to say that as I think I'm accurate in this, Mark, he said he couldn't remember if he went back and watched it, which again is just more fodder for either his.
Okay, Al Jazeera had a good
analysis. After Biden's disastrous performance at a debate watched by 51 million people, the liberal commentariat finally admitting the obvious, now lining up, calling for him to stand aside. Along with the New York Times, just a few months ago, the Times had a columnist taking the Biden aging story and stylizing it. Within 24 hours of the debate, the paper's editorial team agreed it is time for this president to go.
The most kind of brazen about faces come from Joe Scarborough at MSNBC's Morning Joe. Scarborough just 3 months ago said that he had spoken with Biden.
He's far beyond cogent. In fact, I think he's better than he's ever been.
3 months later, he is on TV telling people that maybe the president needs to step down.
I fear Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States unless things change.
So this is a pretty stunning and I would say delegitimizing incident for the press, which you might say was complicit in keeping the public in the dark.
They were hoping that the debate would help counter the concerns of Biden's age and his cognitive abilities.
Excuse me, with dealing with everything we have to do with.
Yeah, who looks best being orange, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? Obviously Joe Biden. No, obviously Donald Trump. So the same sort of eccentricities when exhibited by each candidate. With Trump, they are entertaining. With Biden, not so much.
Look,
they're painful.
Liberal commentators, they can't really counteract that particular argument. Only Biden himself can effectively dismantle those concerns through his own performance, which he completely failed to do. And so liberal commentators were confronted now with this real crisis.
The instant the country saw the debate, it became too obvious to ignore. For those media outlets, it became embarrassing to them.
He was incapable of doing better than he was, and you can't come back from that.
It's sort of the emperor has no clothes moment. You can't continue to say, no, the emperor does have clothes. It's like, we all saw what we saw, and the media is complicit, certainly, in hiding this issue.
The speed with which liberal mainstream outlets turned on this story, detaching themselves from this president, has dropped jaws across the U.S. That U-turn has been seized upon by conservatives at places like Fox News that have been fixated on the Biden aging story for years.
Now they're asking the same question. They don't remember that we know that they sat on their hands.
There was a time in 2019 when liberal outlets talked about Biden's mental condition openly when he was still seeking the
Right, this is true. When they thought they could get a more left-wing candidate, they piled on Joe Biden's age back in 2019. Then when Joe Biden became the Democratic nominee, they became silent. Not silent, but they reduced the intensity of their discussion.
Democratic nomination.
The question is, does he still have his stuff? How sharp is he?
But once Biden became the nominee and then took the reins of power, that changed. Even though the clues kept coming, the momentary lapses, Biden's staff keeping his public appearances to a bare minimum, questions about his cognitive capabilities largely went away.
He's actually perfectly sharp. He's up to the job.
Most of what Americans were seeing of the story was not journalism. It was a closing of the ranks.
It was almost as if a curtain just came down and this topic was banned from discussion.
More wild speculation from a bunch of people who have probably never been in a room with Joe Biden and certainly don't have medical degrees that I'm aware of.
It also reflects a shift since 2016, since Trump's election, where a lot of the media looked at the way that they're reporting, completely accurate reporting, on Hillary Clinton's scandals, ultimately helped put Trump in the White House. And what they decided was certain facts are just too sensitive to tell the public, which cannot always be trusted to make the right decision.
This is not necessarily unique to the Biden administration. This is just how Washington works. In order to get big stories, in order to get scoops, you have to have access. And in order to maintain access, you can't piss off the people who you're covering. And only when...
So it's a little bit like Orthodox Judaism, where many facts are covered up or not discussed. If by keeping them hidden, you're more likely to encourage people to observe Torah law. So you can find a full discussion of this in Mark Shapiro's great book, Changing the Immutable.
It's unavoidable, like it became on Thursday night. That's when you see people changing their tune because they know that they won't be outcast anymore because everyone is doing it at the same time.
It's undeniable that there are major media outlets in this country that first and foremost worship power, that elite media follows its own circle. It's like a gravitational pull of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And typically, what's not acceptable in elite media consensus in the United States is to ask uncomfortable questions of power. What's been interesting about this moment is that I have never seen elite media consensus change so quickly.
We have talked a lot here over the years about Joe Biden's age.
If Joe Biden's cognitive condition was the elephant in the room, then American alternative news outlets were the canaries in the coal mine.
So if you didn't have an ideological agenda, right, Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline would be a major story.
Detecting and reporting on the dangers of this story.
Anyone who says that his, mental health is totally fine and, there isn't a decline, there is lying.
Unlike the mainstream media, where Fox has ideological reasons to focus on Biden's age issues, it's been liberal voices leading the way online, attracting voters fearful of putting such a flawed, aging candidate up against Donald Trump come November.
That's been part of sort of the underlying criticism of mainstream media forever. It ignores the burgeoning group of voters, people disenchanted with politics. This is when you see rise of independent news outlets like my own and many others trying to get outside of that media ecosystem where you.
So it's not like there's something inherently superior about being independent or being a blogger or a vlogger, right? Different situations will redound to the benefit of the establishment or to those on the margins.
You can only do good journalism if you appease your sources and you maintain that access.
We are in such a fragmented information environment. For the candidates, it's an additional challenge because they no longer have the ability to control the story the way they used to when they worked with the mainstream 3 news stations and print outlets to help drive a particular story. The public is hearing these different opinions and perspectives, and each does contribute to the way the public thinks about the presidency and who is the best person to lead.
CNN is one of the liberal-leaning news outlets that tended to avoid covering the president's age-related issues. Now, one of its mainstay anchors, Jake Tapper, has declared his network is all in on.
So there might be many stories where CNN is superior to Al Jazeera or Russia Today, but then there are going to be stories where marginalized news outlets like Al Jazeera or Russia Today do a superior job. Some stories, right, certain bloggers would do a superior job to the most prestigious journalists at the New York Times.
On this story, despite the Orwellian messaging coming out of the White House.
The spinning is all very reminiscent of the George Orwell quote from the book 1984. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. We're not going to do that today on The Lead. We're going to talk on it.
In other words, we will stay on a story that CNN has barely touched for the past.
Jake Tapper does a lot of good work.
3 years. The vast majority of the coverage now comes with the inevitable horse race angle. What does this mean for the upcoming election? If Biden, who insists he's not going anywhere, is not there to fight.
Right, so what does this mean for the upcoming election? How is this going to affect Joe Biden's vote in Wisconsin? That just overwhelms other aspects of this story, such as the threat to national security. Why do we allow the nuclear codes to be in the hands of someone who's obviously senile?
Who will the Democratic candidate be? Not nearly enough of the coverage has been in the now. With catastrophic wars ongoing in Ukraine and in Gaza, what effect is Biden's aging having on those conflicts, on the victims?
The president has phone calls with Benjamin Netanyahu, reportedly pushing him to change course. And the Israeli prime minister simply dismisses him. And as you watch Trump humiliating Biden on stage, you have to wonder, is Netanyahu, who is known for being a masterclass manipulator, is he taking advantage of a president who is not at his best faculties to continue this?
Okay, let's look at this Megyn Kelly conversation with Steve Krakauer.
He can't do it. He's unable to prosecute the case against Donald Trump.
Megan, they have a home studio in their main home during the summer. Right. I mean, this was like Joe Scarborough.
All right, talking about Morning Joe, so let me rewind a little bit.
hired. And I got real questions about these advisors that would put him out after, meanwhile, he'd been back stateside for 10 days. It's just such an obvious lie. I think she literally took their talking points and
talking about Mika Brzezinski, co-host of Morning Joe,
made a little memo for herself out of it and read it on the air. But meanwhile, Scarborough was missing in action, weirdly on vacation without his wife that day, after going out on the air that previous Friday and saying, he didn't say the words, "I was wrong," but he said he can't do it. He's unable to prosecute the case against Donald Trump.
Megan, they have a home studio in their main home during the summer.
Right.
I mean, this was like Joe Scarborough in the other room, okay, not going out on air to do this.
Right, too ashamed. I really do wonder, what happened behind the scenes? I'd love to know. So the New York Times, I think it's actually rather amazing, the amount of chutzpah that they are showing in now condemning him as old and infirm and incapable, given how they dismissed the videos showing us all of that as cheap fakes just weeks ago. Now, his cognitive problems have been long in the making. You and I, we reminded the audience that back in 2022, we did an episode. It was an early episode for our show, doing a deep dive in his cognitive abilities. And we talked behind the scenes about, is this appropriate? We don't want to diagnose somebody who we haven't actually seen. That's not right. But this is a news story. And we put on Dr. Bredesen, who's an expert in brain health. We took it very seriously back then, but almost nobody was touching it back then.
And that was specifically why we did it. This is a little peek behind the curtain here, but you and I have these conversations and say, what is true and what are people not saying? What is the story that's important, that is absolutely based in truth, but that people are afraid to talk about, that people are not doing? And Biden's cognitive fitness and his cognitive decline was certainly one of them. And so we said, well, let's take it seriously. We had on people from the left and right, Rich Lowry and Ryan Grimm. We had on Dr. Bredesen, a specialist in brain health. Let's take it seriously. Let's actually do this because it's important. And obviously, we've been seeing this for years, and there has been a lot of reporting in the last few days.
So Michael Tracy has a tweet here discussing the ultimate dream of a center-right think tank.
Only in America. Young, gay, Afro-Latino, and a passionate Zionist serving in the U.S. Congress. This week on Firing Line.
I am fired up, and I'm looking forward to causing good trouble.
Only in America.
All right, Glenn Greenwald.
Current sitting elected president, out of a election that he obviously wants to run in, that he was named the Democratic nominee for, and one that he has no intention of leaving. And yet there is a concerted effort on the part of the media that had long protected Joe Biden, but that is so desperate to do anything to ensure Donald Trump doesn't win, but also the kind of 500 or 1,000 people that really run the Democratic Party, the very large funders, the oligarchs, that fund the Democratic Party, and both of them are in a concerted effort to force Joe Biden out of a race that, whatever you think of Joe Biden, he is the president and wants to remain in. And that obviously raises all kinds of interesting questions about what type of democracy the United States is. We're constantly hearing from the Democratic Party that they and they alone can protect and preserve American democracy. And this raises a lot of questions. Now, one of the questions before we get to that is that we have long heard over the last several weeks from Biden defenders that the reason it's so inappropriate to force Joe Biden out of office is because the Democratic Party voters, their sacred voters who have the power in our system of government to make decisions, were given a wide choice, and they decided that they wanted Joe Biden to be their presidential nominee in 2024, and it's therefore inappropriate to try and deny them that wish. Now, the reality is that as the Democratic Party claims that it is the only believer in or protector of American democratic values, the Democratic Party for years now has been acting in an extremely repressive and anti-democratic way, especially when it comes to choosing who the nominee of the president for the presidency that party will have. That's been the case in 2016 and in 2020, but also in 2024. The idea that Democratic voters were given a free choice and decided that they were going to vote for Joe Biden as the nominee that they wanted is an absolute joke. The Democratic Party, more than a year ago, was clear and explicit that they were not going to allow any primary challenges to Joe Biden. That even if there were primary challengers, and there were, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson and others, they would not allow any debates. They would not give those candidates any chance to even get on ballots, and that they had declared before any vote was cast that no matter what, the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party would be Joe Biden. Now, that stands in stark contrast to what the Republican Party did. You'll probably recall that a lot of different well-known and established and popular and very well-funded politicians like current Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and former Vice President Mike Pence ran for the Republican nomination. They were given the opportunity to appear on screen and in debates, and people voted for Donald Trump. He was the actual choice of the Republican Party to be the nominee. The Democratic Party did the opposite. They foreclosed any possibility of having a Democratic vote. Here was Simone Sanders, who worked both in the for the Biden White House and then also for Kamala Harris. And then, like so many of them, like Jen Psaki, she left to do the same thing at MSNBC. She's an official Democratic Party spokeswoman, but for MSNBC, she went on Morning Joe in May of 2023. And this is what she announced about the upcoming Democratic primary to determine who will be the nominee for 2024.
Bobby Kennedy Jr. doing well. He's at 19%. Hasn't really gotten that much out there. I mean, and I'm starting to hear more and more talk about him. Are we going to actually have a challenge here?
I'm trying not to laugh, Joe. There's not going to
Wait,
be.
can I stop you for a second?
Yes.
Do you know how many people said the same thing about Donald Trump in 2015 on this show?
Except
said
I will
the
note,
same exact thing.
Yes, because there was going to be a Republican primary. But I really think that the mealy-mouthed Democrats, as I like to call them, and some of my progressive friends.
Okay, so first of all, she's saying that Joe Scarborough tried to say you're laughing at the idea that anybody might be able to win over Joe Biden. And then Joe Scarborough said, well, people were saying the same thing in 2016 about Donald Trump. They were scoffing at the idea that he might win. And she said, yeah, but the difference is the Republican Party actually allowed a primary in 2016. So anybody might win, whoever the voters choose. In contrast, we're the Democratic Party, and we are not going to have a primary. We're not going to allow anyone to challenge Joe Biden. And that's why I'm saying I know for certain Biden will win, because there's not going to be any kind of free and fair election. There's not going to be an election at all. Listen to what she says.
Who would like to live in a fantasy land, they need to come back to reality. Yeah. And the reality is this: the sitting president of the United States of America is a Democrat that would like to run for re-election, so much so that he has declared a re-election campaign. Right. In that case, the Democratic National Committee will not facilitate a primary process. There will be no debate stage for Bobby Kennedy, Marianne Williamson, or anyone else to stand on.
So we're going to have another Bobby Kennedy in an empty chair in the debate, right?
There will be no debate.
Yeah, no debate.
The Democratic National Committee administers the debates, and they're not going to set up.
All right, we have a tweet here from the Oversight Committee of the House of Representatives. Representative James Comey reveals that President Biden's physician was involved in the Biden's business dealings, resulting in $200,000 landing in Joe Biden's bank account. Did his involvement impact his medical assessment of the president?
Up a primary process for debates for someone to challenge the head of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
I mean, one more. Do you hear what she said? She said the Democratic Party, the DNC, will not facilitate a primary election. There will be nobody permitted to challenge Joe Biden. We will not have any presidential debates. The Democratic Party won't allow them. And we are telling you right now, before a single vote is cast, that the nominee of our party will be Joe Biden. Not because I'm predicting that based on what the voters might do, but that we're not going to give the voters any opportunity to actually choose. There's no choice, she said.
Right. So most politicians' rhetoric about democracy is just propaganda. All right. Back to this Zoom call hosted by Mark Halperin yesterday.
Prevarication or its decline.
Yeah. Mark, thank you. Stay with us, please.
Yeah.
Chime back in. Andrew Essex, I'm wondering if I can bring you in. I want to ask you about messaging. I ask you to unmute and turn your camera on if you will, Andrew. Maybe you won't. There we go. Andrew Essex is a genius at messaging and storytelling. So, Andrew, I'd love for you to take them in either order.
Right. So a story can be persuasive, but it has to meet the needs of the audience, right? Persuasive messaging, right? Powerful narratives are not just supply side, right? They depend for their success on the demand. And it's just become so overwhelmingly obvious that Joe Biden is not fit for the office of President of the United States that all the effective messaging in the world is not going to save Joe Biden.
If you were trying to tell a story of Joe Biden's resilient comeback or the story of how Kamala Harris should be the nominee, can you tell either of those stories? Just like a simple like storyboarding, like what would that be about? What are those two stories?
With all due respect, there's no story for Joe. There's no way to put that toothpaste back in the tube.
Right. We generally overstate the power of propaganda. So all the Nazi propaganda and communist propaganda of the Soviet Union and China, it did not change the minds of people who are allied against it. All right. It at best, it reinforced those who are already favorably inclined in that direction. But it doesn't change minds.
He would have to have some Olympian transformation, and it would be fraudulent. With Kamala, I think there's a real opportunity to represent her in some way. Probably around an issue, probably around abortion, but she needs to be reintroduced, as you've said several times. And with the right sizzle film, with the right production values, she can be represented as a new choice, and that will galvanize half the population.
Yeah. In your circles, and you travel and you live in New York, and you know lots of folks. How are people in your world feeling now? Are they hoping for Kamala, or are people saying we need another choice?
Joe Biden has never been nationally popular, and he didn't have any enthusiasm on his side in the 2020 election. It's just that he was seen by enough people in the suburbs, in particular, to be superior to Donald Trump, and that's why he was elected president. So there's not a groundswell of passionate support for Joe Biden, right? And there hasn't been ever.
I'm with my in-laws right now. The level of hostility towards her is mind-blowing, particularly from people on the right, as exemplified by what Newt said. But I think there's
are your in-laws Republicans?
Yes, extremely.
Yeah.
So anyone who's from the Fox right has a visceral hatred for her, but I think that there's a lot of curiosity, and most people don't really know her. She's been characterized as a laughing hyena, but if she has an issue and she's coached properly, she can be put back on message as an avatar for women's rights, for some kind of prosecutorial zeal. She has characteristics that could be represented in a positive way. I wouldn't rule her out as
well. Would she be your choice?
I think most Democratic elites realize that running Joe Biden and running Kamala Harris would be losing tickets. By contrast, Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, or even Gavin Newsom gives the Democrats a greater chance of winning in November.
At this point, all things considered, or would you rather see an open process?
I'd rather see an open process, but I think that's implausible.
Okay. You and I largely agree, as is often the case. Andrew, thank you. I'm going to start calling on folks with their hands up. It's all men right now, and I'd love for some women to be talking here. So,
and the big thing we were all talking about at breakfast this morning.
All right, this is Meghan McCain.
Was the New York Post reporting that the #1 leading specialist doctor of Parkinson's spent 6 hours in the White House with Joe Biden in January. Now, that could be anything. They just signed.
The New York Post is highly unreliable journalism. So normally a major news operation the size of the New York Post is accorded some measure of respectability and believability. That's true for every news operation of the New York Post size except for the New York Post. It's the most reckless of any major newspaper in the United States.
And a bill for Parkinson's, but the conclusion in question was, does he have Parkinson's? And every single move he makes, people are going to question his health. And I still believe, just from not a doctor, but from what I'm seeing, he's very ill. But there's a lot of Democrats that seem to be okay with losing to Trump, rather than make any changes, and rather like sort of taking responsibility for, this huge lie. And it's been a huge lie. And if they think that they're going to be able to spin their way against the American public in the press or Democratic operatives, they're wrong. This is not landing. I mean, with a certain group of people, who hate Trump so much they can never see reality, then they'll be fine. But I'm just surprised. I think what the speaker said, I'm feeling more.
Question in the chat: how has Democracy Now! Been covering Senility Gate? Well, Democracy Now! Is socialist. They've been covering it fairly aggressively. Donald Trump is, Joe Biden has never been a favorite of Democracy Now!
More like this country is being run by Jill Biden and Hunter Biden, and they're the last people making the decision. And that honestly, they would rather have like the Bastille burned down and have Trump win than get out of office and admit that they've been lying. And that to me is a complete, it's a cataclysmic shift in how especially young people are going to view politics. And Democrats no longer are going to have the capacity to have any kind of moral high ground on anything. And I just don't understand why you would want to vote for someone in a coma. Nobody hates Trump more than me, trust me, but I don't understand. And I don't understand how you can say it's okay to have, while so many wars are going on, while we're so vulnerable as a country. So I that's just been surprising to me to see the amount of Democrats who are completely defiant. And I was sure he was going to drop out yesterday. And today I'm sure that, maybe Hunter and Jill and the president are going to sit in the White House and let it just burn to the ground. But it's just crazy to me that the president could vomit on himself on live television and there's a group of Democrats that would be okay with it.
Megan, two questions for you. Thank you for all that. First of all, what did you think of the ABC interview? Meaningless, negative?
No, because Grandma T's got to keep those.
Hold on 1 second. Let me mute that person and ask you to unmute again, Megan. Go ahead.
Sorry. I thought look, it wasn't as bad as the debate, but it wasn't good. The fact that he can't remember if he had watched his own debate performance or not, he still looks extremely old to me and infirm, and it's just not going to be enough. And what you were talking about with him doing radio interviews where the questions are given in advance, like we're really entering like Baghdad Bob, North Korea propaganda level. I mean, I can't believe they would let him go into interviews where the questions are given in advance. Like,
right. Once you become an object of derision in a relationship or in running for political office, you don't have much of a chance, right? Once your partner starts consistently speaking to you and treating you with contempt, that relationship is likely finished. And if you're running for political office and there's a generalized contempt for you, you don't have much chance. Now, think about Donald Trump's Access Hollywood tape. Right, among the elite, there was overwhelming contempt for Donald Trump, but regular blokes and regular people understood that this is a common way that men speak in a locker room. And so regular people did not tend to have contempt for Donald Trump over the Access Hollywood remarks where he said that women who are highly attracted to him, he could just move aggressively on them and grab them by the pussy. Well, if a woman wants to go to bed with you, you may very well succeed by grabbing them by the pussy. And I think millions of regular Americans understood that. He wasn't talking about going up to random strangers and grabbing them.
And 22 minutes with George Stephanopoulos, and I thought George was fine, but 22 minutes with him is not going to be enough. But I guess the question just, again, is if Democrats are okay with having a president who possibly has Parkinson's, who could be in a coma, who could embarrass us and himself on a level that we've never seen in modern times, if they're okay with it, I just think that it's ushering in the second Trump era. And I'm just shocked that there are still so many people who are going to have their head in the sand and are, somehow blaming people like me for looking out and speaking.
Yes, Donald Trump literally said they let you grab them by the pussy. He wasn't talking about imposing that on people who didn't want it.
The truth, but I will say.
And yet his remarks were described as sexual assault, right? If that's sexual assault, then a large part of the way that men initiate sex is with consenting women. It has to be classified as sexual assault, right? This is an Andrea Dworkin-style analysis that was pervasive in the mainstream media.
Say that like Alex Thompson from Axios has been reporting on this for an extremely long time. And from what I was told recently, he actually had a book deal taken away because he was reporting on this kind of health. And now he's on every network, on every show right now, doing his reporting. So I do think the journalists who have like been on this, like Olivia Newsy has this really crazy piece that just came out about her interactions with Biden. Like what's fascinating is that a lot of people in the press seem to be on the side of those of us that think that it's worth knowing if the president has a cognitive disorder. And, you have Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who's like America's doctor, coming out saying he needs to have a cognitive analysis done. So I do think like they can only put so much in the dam for so long. But at this point, I really think they could like wheel him in a wheelchair onto the convention floor. And there's going to be a bunch of Democrats that just say it's not Trump, so it's fine.
How does the deep state fit into this election? I don't see signs of sinister deep state interference. I see an inept Biden administration receiving advice from crack addict son Hunter. So I don't think a deep state has been running Joe Biden for the past 4 years.
Fine.
Megan, what's the best outcome for you at this point?
I mean, this is so bad. The best outcome, I mean, if I were Democrats, I'm a gambler. I would roll the dice on Kamala or someone else, because I think, when you have 70 to 80% of the American public, including Democrats, saying his age is a deal-breaking issue, I would make him step down. You keep making the point that no one can make him step down, which is entirely possible. But it takes a village. Hillary Clinton is right. It takes a village. If you get no support for your narrative outside of your family, eventually you're going to abandon that narrative. If you convert to Orthodox Judaism and nobody in your Orthodox synagogue accepts you as an Orthodox Jew nor counts you in a minion, you're not going to be able to keep up the story that you're now a Jew. If I were in any way related to the Trump campaign, I would find the most moderate, cozy Republican that is the kind of
Glenn Youngkin, governor of Virginia.
Republican people like me and make them their running mate. I would not do a JD Vance. I would not do a Vivek Ramaswamy, no MAGA person. I would do, like the speaker said, a Governor Youngkin, like someone who's just super moderate and very accessible to Republicans like me. I don't know if he'll end up doing that, but there's a lot that if Trump can remain even semi-disciplined, there's a lot to make up. But look, this is like a hell.
So Donald Trump's campaign this time around is incredibly disciplined compared to his previous efforts in 2016 and 2020.
Doomsday scenario for the country. I've been so upset, and it's not just about me, but I think if I'm upset, a lot of people are upset, and I feel like our country is extremely vulnerable to our.
And so, comment in the chat, it's hard to think that people are this stupid. Well, when people are motivated to believe something stupid, and when it's reinforced by their social group, people will go along with all sorts of stupid things.
Enemies, if they, seeing that we have.
Right. We're not evolutionarily designed to speak inconvenient and unpopular truths to the people that we're closest to. Right. We're evolutionarily designed to go along because the safest way to live is to live in the center of the herd. And you don't get to stay in the center of the herd by saying things that are unpopular.
This insane Game of Thrones dying king as our president, and we're supposed to pretend like he's not as sick as he is. And you're asking what you're asking the American public to do, and I think this is particularly triggering for people who have had to take care of ailing parents. It is not my job to monitor the president's health. It's not my job to know whether or not he's going to be okay.
Who wants to be Trump's vice president? Because that would be a particularly humiliating position. Well, JD Vance badly wants it. He says he'll be disappointed if he doesn't get it. So Marco Rubio wants it. Governor Burgum wants it. So there are people who badly want it.
Okay. But if you're telling me I have to be okay with the president having a nap during the afternoon who is only functional between 10 in the morning and 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening, it is an insane ask of the American public. And I honestly can't believe Democrats, who are always on the moral high horse, who are always so much better than everybody else. I cannot believe that is an ask you're asking Americans, particularly Americans who are living on the poverty line, who are having trouble feeding Sorry, I think it's putting them at the risk. Thank you.
Mayo Fowler, unmute. There you go. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Mark.
How are you?
Here's some silver linings for Kamala Harris, who I think is going to be the next president of the United States. I think this is a wild, wild election like 1860, and she's a dark horse, which, let's say, that's a silver lining because the American public at large do not know her.
Moderate Democrat, I really appreciated what Mr. Gingrich had to say, but I disagree with him slightly in that he pointed to the fact that it is the policies that people are against with Biden. Now, well, I certainly agree that the border is an issue for Biden, but if you look at polling, his age is the albatross that is around his neck. I mean, 70 to 80% of the people in America say that he is unfit because of his age to be president.
Yeah, I think a Democratic Party with Joe Biden's formal policy agenda could very easily win president of the United States. But Joe Biden's mental decline precludes it.
I'm just going to stop you for saying to say the polling also shows that immigration and inflation are problems too. So
right. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, without a doubt. Yes, the border is it was without a doubt an issue. But my point is, and what I'm commenting on is every hedge, every halt, every misspeak is going to be scrutinized over just so tightly. And I cannot imagine, I don't understand exactly. And I guess my question is, and I'm hoping that people will speak to the president about this that are in his inner circle, how can you run a campaign when that level of scrutiny is going to be on every speech, every campaign stop? I just don't know how it's possible.
So there are two primary ways that we tense up. One prominent Alexander teacher noted this, right? One common way that we become unnecessarily tense and compressed and pulling down and operating with less grace and efficiency is the desire to be perfect. And so the more scrutiny you get under, then the more tense you're going to become. And then the other thing that leads to way too much unnecessary body tension and compression is the desire, or is the thinking, oh man, I just got too much to do and not enough time to do it. So the more scrutiny Joe Biden falls under, the less effectively he will perform.
To withstand that level of scrutiny, that the focus is going to be on not what he says, but how he said it.
Yeah, well, Jason, I think you're right. I think it'd be extremely difficult, particularly because he can't perform that well, right? If he were great and he was got a lot of scrutiny, he could try to win people back. But as I've said from the beginning of this, since the debate, all the things the Democrats.
Okay, so we got some early indications from France. France election shock. The left wins big. The far right finishes third. And the Emmanuel Macron gamble apparently paid off.
Democrats want him to do to prove that he can do this are the exact things he can't do, which is why he wasn't doing them. The press conference on Thursday will be fantastically interesting. And maybe he'll perform great again, assuming he gets to Thursday, which I think he will at this point. But let me ask you, Jason, if you could pick the Democratic nominee, who would you pick?
If I could pick the Democratic nominee, and if it was just up Josh Shapiro,
they have to be constitutional eligible. Josh Shapiro, yeah.
Josh Shapiro, I think it'd be fantastic.
And what adjectives would you use to describe your posture if it's Kamala Harris as your nominee? Excited.
Excited that she is young and new and fresh, and I think that she would create a lot of energy to the ticket just because she's new and she is not Trump or Biden. I think that in itself is.
You're no doubt in your mind, unlike what Speaker Gingrich thinks, that she'd be stronger than Joe Biden. No doubt.
Yes, without a doubt.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. Let's go to the other Jason who had his hand up, which I didn't notice. We had two Jasons. Jason Weingarten. Go ahead, Jason. Spelled differently. Jason, go ahead.
Thank you. So I would say, we're a week after the debate. It seems like Biden has not done what he needs to do to reassure the crowd.
Jason, are you a D or an R or something else?
I'm not party affiliated. I'm here in San Francisco, though. So I guess you can guess the water that I swim in.
Okay. But who, if it's Trump Biden, who will you vote for?
The couch.
Okay. You're a couch man. Okay, go ahead.
Couch. So I would say Trump has probably done what he needed to do this past week, stay out of it, let the implosion happen and just kind of, be off in the distance. I'm wondering if you think that Kamala has done what she's needed to do in the past week, and then some of the other names on the blue side of the aisle, if they have done what maybe they needed to do in the past week, or are setting themselves up for what they need to do to step forward if the time does come, or when the time does come.
I think in the limited things she's done, she's been pitch perfect. People criticize her for one of her tweets, but I think she's been pretty good. And I think everybody else who might be hopeful has done pretty well. None of them have been critical of the president publicly, but I know that at least some of them have doubts about it. And I don't know that any of them are super enthusiastic about it running against Kamala Harris if she's in. But, she talked to CBS News very briefly. She was
right. And why would her competitors be unenthusiastic about running? Because by virtue of her being a Black Asian woman, these are sacred categories for the woke perspective, for the left-wing perspective. Right? These are demographics which are not deserving of public criticism.
At the 4th of July event, she's done some of the events of her own. She's done Q&A that have gotten not that much attention. They're not on camera, but she's handled the questions pretty well. And I thought she was great the night of the debate. So if people are looking to see if she's got, if she's sort of in the groove here to get ready if she's the nominee, I think she's done pretty well of late. Jason, thank you. Let's go to, Andrew. Tell everybody who you are, Andrew.
Hey, Mark. Hey, everyone. I'm Andrew Scharf, a Republican voter from Palm Beach, Florida. Great to be here, and really scintillating conversation. My question, to you, Mark, and everyone else on the call. We discussed earlier potential pressure from Senator Schumer and Congressman Jeffries, and that's domestic. After seeing this debate, what do our partners around the world feel about this? And is that the next leg of this report that's really going to cause the dominoes to fall? Because if you really think about it, they've been interacting with what seems to be like a shadow government here. And it's terrifying to think about. And how do you think that part of the story plays out?
Yeah. So one of the things I left out from my list and my news summary at the top was a Politico story, which they felt so passionately about that they sent out a breaking news alert on it. The headline is, American allies fear Biden is finished and can't beat Trump. We're not sure that even if he wins, he can survive 4 years more, said one NATO official. I think this week, my guess, I'm only guessing, there's not reporting, that President Biden thinks, well, I'll be at the NATO summit, I'll look presidential, I'll be in my element. If you look at what's happened to European diplomats.
So men are naturally programmed to prefer younger women, and women are naturally programmed to try to shame and castigate men for preferring younger women. It's also to women's evolutionary advantage to portray themselves as sexually chaste, but often they will let loose in this department when they go traveling. So Richard Cooper has a tweet, women in Europe, I swear I didn't hook up on my 3-month trip to Europe. Also, women in Europe, they say...
Okay, so I was just in the ocean, staring at this couple because they were so beautiful, and I was like, damn, like one day, like they were having just such a cute moment, and I look over, and this guy's like, hi. So fine. Oh my God, his eyes are just insane. Anyway.
I didn't have this queued up correctly. Here we go.
And this guy's like, hi. So fine. Oh my God, his eyes are just insane. Anyways, we get to talking. He's cool. He's like, I'll show you around. I'll take you wherever you want to go. I'm like, cool. Anyways, I'm going to leave with him right now. Came over to my seat again, and he goes, all right, no shower, nothing. Let's go get pizza and watch the sunset. And I was like, okay. And he's going to give me a free ride home. All right. He's beautiful, but I don't know how it's going to go, so wish me luck. Maybe this is my Italian stallion that I've been searching for. Going with the flow. I'm just saying yes. Stay tuned, I guess.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao from Sicily. We are...
Cannot convince me.
I don't want
Look at me.
No.
Come on.
No. I don't speak English, sorry.
Okay, let's I think we see where that went. Right, back to Mark Halperin.
It's the exact parallel of what's happened to Democrats, which in the Biden orbit, which is they're willing now to say stuff to reporters that they weren't willing to say before. So I suspect Republicans will play this card. I know the Trump campaign will eventually play it very hard if Biden's the nominee. The notion that he's not qualified to be commander in chief. And I think you'll see it this week. I think almost certainly in the context of NATO, you'll see blind quotes from diplomats along the lines of what's in this Politico story of people basically almost moving past Biden to say, of course, Biden can't be president. And of course, he's not going to win the election. And we've already seen that in Japan. It's been the assumption for a while that Trump was going to win. I think in Europe, if you took a poll of foreign ministers and prime ministers now, I'd be surprised if anybody in that group thought Trump was going to lose. So I think it's another one of the Shakespearean aspects of this, which is Joe Biden, former chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, spends more time on foreign policy than almost anything else. I think will be in denial about how brutal this is going to be for him. And again, this is something. This is kind of a piece with Republicans saying he can't be president. Obviously, the biggest component of that is national security. So I think it's just going to be a massive issue. And will continue for a while. Alex Castellanos, I'd love for you to say, if you worked for the Trump, thank you, Andrew. If you worked for the Trump campaign, Alex, how would you message this in a spot or from the candidate in terms of the national security stuff?
I don't think I could do anything better than what Joe Biden is doing to himself right now. The more and you inject politics into this, the less credible you make it. Joe Biden is craving to be in a political fight with Donald Trump right now. That would be a good day for him. So I'd leave this alone because we haven't hit bottom yet. We think this is historically unprecedented, but it can get worse and it will. Not only his abilities, but the world is a tinderbox. Predatory nations are going to try to take advantage of this. And on top of that, Joe Biden is going to find himself in a position where it's his political advantage to be the strong man. Irony of ironies. So I think we've got 4 months ahead of unprecedented danger here. And right now, less politics from Trump. I do think he's got to rethink his VP choice. And maybe somebody like the governor of Virginia, because you may have a generational ticket. And I do think that folks who've talked about that are exactly right. Both parties are just starved for generational change. And Trump's a lot of things, but he's not that.
Alex, I don't know that your governor has been vetted, so I'm not sure he's in a position to be picked.
Right.
Who says stability and the other characteristics you're talking about best between Burgum, Vance, and Rubio?
Probably you would think Burgum, but I would make the argument that it's Rubio because he's been there, because the nation's more familiar with him, because he has been vetted and tested. And if you get a Shapiro on the ticket, say with Kamala Harris, I'm not sure Doug Burgum can stand that much heat posting up to a really strong, fiery Democrat who could, like Whitmer or Shapiro or like a Bashir.
Thank you, Alex. Vice President Harris is in New Orleans today doing some political events at the Essence Festival. And I'll just read you one great piece of color from the poll report, or two pieces of color. On the photo line, she signed a poster that said, "First, but not the last." And one of the songs playing while she was on the photo line was "Control" by Janet Jackson. To KCD, unmute, please.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to chime in on the, I'm largely agreeing with most people, I would say I'm an independent. So I would say I would be pretty torn if it was Kamala and Shapiro versus Trump and Rubio. I would struggle with that choice. I really would.
Who's your choice if it's Trump Biden?
I'm sort of, I hate to say this, but I think I would write in.
Not throwing in the towel. It's time for him to go home. He's blackout. His friends need to call him an Uber and send him back to Delaware. I think when it comes to Gen Z, and I reach millions of Gen Z people, I read thousands of comments. I work on Gen Z comms. There's no way to really rebrand Biden, and there hasn't been for a long time. I think their best bet to ignite young people would be to put Kamala forward. I've been seeing a lot of Kamala memes, a lot of excitement online around Kamala.
I mean, how delusional is this guy who thinks there's a lot of excitement online around Kamala Harris?
When it comes to Trump, I want to see Burgum or Youngkin as VP. What Trump did incredibly well in 2016, I was just talking about this a few days ago on a radio show, he chose someone who was the antithesis of him in the public's eye, right? So Trump was this bombastic New York Post guy. He had The Apprentice. He was a ladies' man. He chose a VP who seemed very stable, very milquetoast, very boring with Mike Pence. I think he's going to need a Burgum or a Youngkin to bring those independents who are on the fence, those people who couldn't bring themselves to vote for Trump before, but they say, oh, he's got a Burgum with him or a Youngkin. I don't see Rubio bringing that, to be completely honest. I think Rubio also has a lot of bad clips from years in the past. So that's pretty much how I feel. I also, something just as someone who's an independent media like Jessica, a majority of Americans, you can look at any poll, are distrustful of the mainstream media. And this past week has just pushed it over the edge because you've got people like Joe Scarborough and all the, Rachel Maddow, who for years have carried water for Biden. Even months ago, Joe was saying Biden's the sharpest he's ever been. This is the best Biden we've ever had. And clearly they've been lying to us. So I don't think it's possible to rebrand Biden when a majority of Americans are online getting their news and aren't watching the mainstream media anyway. They're going to have to do something to bring excitement. And that would be finding someone new.
Okay, like two things. One is in terms of Joe, who's my friend, he spent time with Biden and Biden was fine when he spent time with him. So I don't think Joe was lying. Just didn't see what
he doesn't have to be lying. He engaged in highly motivated reasoning.
We've seen in public. What are the memes, the positive memes about Kamala Harris? What are they based on? Are they based on stuff she said or her biography? What do people like?
No, they're all just comedic memes of her laughing, but I don't know if there's someone and just laughing, other funny moments.
But are
people
they
saying, oh my
positive?
God, I don't, they're almost in a positive light where young people find her exciting or engaging in a sense. I think Kamala has an ability to reach a lot of Gen Z and millennials if they put her in, but then they're going to lose a lot of other people. And my generation is the least likely to show up to vote anyway. So It's just not looking good for the Democrats this time whatsoever.
This is
Lynn, thank you so much. Nancy Glenn.
We have said it every 4 years, but this here one is it. We are looking at an election that will take place in 122 days.
122.
Where on one side, you have the former president who is running to become president again, who has openly talked about his admiration of dictators and his intention to be a dictator on day one, who has openly talked about his intention to weaponize the Department of Justice against his political enemies.
Good thing that Joe Biden didn't do that.
Unmute, please.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you for joining.
Thank you. The little bit of that debate that I could stand, I almost thought to myself, wow, I may have to vote for Trump. Because I've always voted. I just have always voted. I'm not that person that stays.
Who'd you vote for in 16 and 20, if you don't mind my asking?
I voted for Clinton, Hillary Clinton. I think she got a bad rep. I think that when all is said and done, she's a very hard worker. And I voted for Biden because I was never going to vote for Trump. It was not going to happen.
But if it's Trump, if it ends up being Trump Biden,
Peggy Noonan had a good column on this topic.
Biden can't spin his way out of this.
The president's handlers think he can plow ahead, but his position will only get worse. What a tragedy. By Peggy Noonan. July 3rd.
And Peggy Noonan's always been a Joe Biden supporter.
2024. 5:27 p.m. Eastern Time. We are living big history. We do that so often we don't always notice. But a proud president is hunkered down in the White House, and his party is frantically trying to decide whether to press him to step aside from his bid for re-election after a catastrophic 90 minutes revealing that he is neurologically not up to the demands of a campaign or a second term. And revealing, too, that his true condition, the depth of his decline, had been kept, quite deliberately and systematically, from the American people. Oh, the histories that will be written and the villains that will be named. To me, it feels like August 1974. The president's position isn't going to get better, it is going to get worse. The longer he waits to step aside, the crueler his departure will be. The post-debate polls show he is losing support both overall and in the battlegrounds. A cratering like that doesn't happen because you had a bad night or a cold or were tired. It happens when an event starkly and unavoidably shows people what they already suspected. It happens when the event gives them proof. Before the debate, a majority of those polled said they no longer thought he had it in him physically or mentally to do the job of president anymore. After the debate, that number reached 72%. You can't unring that bell. There's no repairing this. His staff can't spin or muscle their way out. He is neurologically compromised. We can all see it. It isn't his fault. You have no governance in how you age and at what speed, or what illnesses or conditions arise. You only have governance in what you do about it. Those who support the president offer suggestions on conference calls. Just get him out there, long, live interviews, lots of news conferences, a big rally in the round with Q&A from the voters. They don't know what they're talking about. He can't do what they want him to do. He can't execute it. He tried to do it last week. The debate was, in effect, a live, high-stakes interview. He won't be able to do it next week or next month either. Old age involves plateaus and plummets. It gets worse, not better. The president's staffers fantasize that they can plow ahead with teleprompter events. He looks stronger at the podium. But no one doubts he can stand and read. His staffers think they can smooth past things with supportive interviews with sympathetic journalists, but that won't work either, not long term. Because everyone saw the debate, or, since, has seen pieces of it, and the image of a debilitated president has burned its way into the American brain, and there's no erasing it. A big part of the president's personal mythos, and it is shared by all of Biden world, is that the guy's a survivor. He always pulls through. You knock him down, he gets back up. An inner belief like that can get you far and gird you. But it can also harden into mere conceit and unrealism and blind you to the real facts of current circumstances.
Okay, that's Peggy Noonan. That'll do it for me.